Hey friend, welcome to Sleepy Old World. Before we begin tonight, one small thing. If this channel has become a place you want to return to, if the slow pace of it and the quiet of these stories feel like the right company for the late hours, would you consider subscribing? And if tonight's video helps you switch off at the end of the day, a like genuinely keeps me motivated to keep making more of them. It takes about 2 seconds, and it makes more difference than I can explain. Drop a comment when you have a moment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. A quiet room in Dublin, a porch in Auckland, a bedroom somewhere in Texas. I read every one of them, truly. All right, are you comfortable? Good, let's go. Tonight we're stepping into a London terraced house in 1850, and I have to tell you, the more research I did for this one, the more it surprised me. I want to give you the one detail that genuinely stopped me cold when I first read it. Quite literally cold as it happens, because here it is. In 1850 London, it did not matter how much money you had. It did not matter if you lived in a single damp room above a chandler's shop or in a 5-story stuccoed mansion in Belgravia with 7 servants on the payroll. On a hard winter morning, you were probably going to wake up and find a thin skin of ice on the inside of your own bedroom window. Not the outside, the inside. Because the fireplace, that great glowing symbol of Victorian comfort we all picture, the one in every period drama with the family gathered cosily around it, was in practice spectacularly inefficient. Something like 90% of the heat it produced went straight up the chimney and out into the London sky, which is part of the reason that sky stayed permanently brown with smoke. The room itself, more often than not, stayed cold enough to frost glass from indoors. So the rich and the poor of 1850 London were united, oddly, by the same small miracle each morning, which was simply getting out from under the blankets at all. Everything else about their lives, as you're about to see, diverged completely. That gap, I think, is the whole story tonight. Now, let us go back. It is just gone 5 in the morning, the dead middle of a January night that has not yet agreed to become morning at all, and somewhere in a narrow brick terrace house off a street you have never heard of, in a part of London that no guidebook would ever send you to, someone is already awake. Maybe she is the wife of a clerk who works for a shipping firm down near the docks, a man who is paid just enough to keep them out of real poverty, and not 1 shilling more. Maybe she's a few years older than that, the only servant in a household that calls itself respectable and can barely afford to be. Maybe she's younger, newly married, still faintly surprised that this cold little house with the damp patch over the scullery door is now, officially, hers to run. It does not matter exactly who she is. What matters is that she is awake before the rest of the city, before the rest of her own family, and that the first task of her entire day, the task on which every other task depends, is to make fire out of nothing. She is not warm. That is the first thing to understand, and it will not stop being true for several hours yet. The blankets she has just left were the only warm thing in the house, and now that she's left them, she's standing on bare boards in a nightdress and shawl, with her breath visible in front of her, a small pale cloud that disappears and reappears with every exhale. Somewhere below her, in the kitchen, last night's fire is dead. Properly dead. Not embers. Not a useful glow she might coax back to life with a little patience. Ash. Cold grey ash. And underneath it the unforgiving iron bars of a grate that needs, before anything else happens in this house today, to be completely cleared, scraped and rebuilt from scratch. This is the part nobody puts in the paintings. She goes down the narrow stairs in the dark, one hand trailing the wall because there is no point lighting a candle yet. Candles cost money, and this particular errand does not require seeing so much as feeling her way by memory through a house she has walked 1,000 times. The kitchen, when she reaches it, holds the night's cold the way a stone holds it, deep and total. Her hands find the grate by touch. The ash is soft and strangely light, almost weightless, and it gets everywhere if you're not careful, into the creases of your knuckles, under your fingernails, a fine grey dust that will be there, faintly, for the rest of the day, no matter how many times you wash. Once the grate is clear, there is the blacking. Not every morning this part, but often enough that it becomes its own kind of ritual. a paste of black lead mixed with a little turpentine or vinegar, worked into the iron with a hard brush until it takes on a low, dull shine. The purpose is not really decoration, though a well-blacked grate is a point of quiet pride for a woman like her, a sign to anyone who happens to look that this house, whatever else it lacks, is kept properly. The purpose is also protection. Bare iron rusts fast in a damp London kitchen, and rust eats a grate's usefulness along with its appearance. So she blacks it most mornings, kneeling on the cold hearthstone in her nightdress with her knees aching against the stone and her hands turning grey. And she does this before the sun is anywhere near the horizon, because by the time the household wakes, the kitchen needs to already feel, however falsely, like a place where warmth happens. Then the actual lighting. Paper first, twisted and crumpled, because paper catches easy and burns fast and gives the whole effort its first small chance at success. Kindling next, thin dry sticks she has been saving, sometimes bought in bundles from a man who comes round with a barrow, sometimes simply whatever scraps of wood she has managed to find or beg or save from a broken crate. She builds it carefully, a little tent of sticks over the paper, leaving gaps for air, because fire, she has learned the hard way, needs to breathe almost as much as a person does. Then the coal, just a little at first, small pieces laid on top, not too much, not yet, because too much coal too soon will simply smother a young flame before it has found its feet. A match, if the household can afford the newer kind, or more likely a spill of paper lit from a banked coal saved overnight in a neighbour's grate, or a tinderbox worked with flint and steel, and a patience that the cold makes harder to summon. The paper catches. The kindling, if she has built it right, catches next, a small orange flicker that throws the first real light the kitchen has seen all night, jumping shadows up the walls, briefly making the whole cramped room look almost alive. And then comes the part that takes the actual time, the part where she crouches at the hearth and blows gently, steadily into the base of the flame, coaxing it, feeding it air the way you might coax a frightened animal toward your hand, because a fire in its first few minutes is a fragile thing, and an impatient breath can kill it as easily as a careful one can grow it. This takes, on a bad morning, with damp coal or stubborn kindling, or a chimney that has not drawn well in weeks, the better part of half an hour. On a good morning it is perhaps 15 minutes start to finish, grate to flame. Either way, by the time there is real fire, properly caught, properly burning, the woman doing this work has been awake for the better part of an hour, and has not yet had a single warm thing happen to her. She has only made it possible, eventually, for warmth to exist somewhere in this house. The warmth itself is still a promise, not yet delivered. 3 miles away, in a part of the city where the streets are wider and the houses stand taller and whiter, and altogether more sure of themselves, the exact same task is happening. Different hands, same ash, same cold iron, same crouched breath at the base of a stubborn flame. The house belongs to a family with money, real money, the kind that came from sugar or shipping, or one of the newer industries that the older families still discuss with a faint curl of the lip even as they quietly invest in them. There are perhaps 8 servants under this roof, possibly more, and the one currently kneeling at a kitchen grate in the basement at 5 in the morning is a young housemaid who has been in service since she was 14 years old. Her name does not appear anywhere in the family's letters or diaries. It would not occur to anyone in the family to record it. We will call her Sarah, because she needs a name and history did not think to give her one, and because somewhere out there a real young woman very much like her existed and was simply never written down. Sarah's morning begins earlier than the clerk's wife 3 miles away, not later, which surprises people the first time they hear it. The fires in this house are not one fire, they are many. The breakfast room fire, the morning room fire, the master's dressing room fire if he likes it warm, increasingly the drawing room fire as well. Now that the lady of the house has decided last winter's chill in that room was simply not to be repeated. Each one needs clearing, blacking on the proper days, building and lighting, and Sarah does this alone or with the help of one other maid before the household above her has so much as opened an eye. By the time the master of the house rings his bell at 7, his dressing room will be warm. He will never see it cold. He will never see it being made warm at all. The fire to him simply exists each morning the way daylight does, an ambient fact of the world rather than the product of one exhausted young woman's hour of crouched, cold, repetitive labour 3 floors below where he sleeps. And here is the detail that I think genuinely complicates the easy story, the one where the rich are simply comfortable and the poor are simply cold. The family's own bedrooms, the actual rooms where they sleep at night, are very often not heated at all. Central heating does not exist yet in any meaningful sense, and even in the grandest London houses, fires are typically lit only in the rooms where the family will be present and active during the day. A bedroom fire, if it happens at all, is usually a small luxury reserved for illness, for the very young, for the very old, or for the truly wealthy households that can afford the staggering quantities of coal required to keep multiple rooms warm around the clock. Most nights, even in Belgravia, even in Mayfair, the lady of the house climbs into a bed in a room every bit as cold as the clerk's wife's bedroom 3 miles away. The blankets are finer, the mattress is better stuffed, with proper horsehair rather than something cheaper and lumpier. There may be a warming pan, a flat metal container filled with hot coals or embers, and run briskly between the sheets before bed to take the worst of the chill off. A small luxury that does make a real difference, and that the clerk's family, more often than not, simply cannot spare the coal for. But the room itself, the air itself, is cold, genuinely cold. The frost finds its way onto those windows too. This is the detail that stops people cold every time I mention it, if you will forgive the pun. We tend to picture Victorian wealth as a kind of total comfort, an absence of physical hardship altogether, and in most ways that picture is correct. But cold in 1850 London was a strange equalizer, not a complete one, not even close. The wealthy woman waking in her cold bedroom will, within the hour, be brought hot water by a servant, dressed by a servant, fed an enormous breakfast prepared by a kitchen staff of 3 or 4 people, and will spend her entire day in heated rooms attended by people whose sole function is her comfort. The clerk's wife waking in her cold bedroom will, within the hour, be doing the dressing, the fetching, the cooking, and the attending herself, for everyone in the house, including eventually herself, if there is time left over once everyone else has been seen to. The cold is shared. Almost nothing else is. Sarah finishes the breakfast room fire a little after 6 and moves on to the next one without much pause, because there is no pause built into a housemaid's morning. Not really, not until the family's needs for the day have all been anticipated and met. She will eat her own breakfast later, in the servants' hall, bread and butter and strong tea, standing or sitting briefly before the next task calls her away, and she will eat it considerably later than the family eats theirs, because the order of service in a house like this runs in one direction only. The family is served first, fed first, warmed first. The household that makes all of that possible eats and warms itself in the gaps that remain. Back in the narrow terrace house, the fire has caught properly now, a small steady orange heart in the grate throwing real warmth out into the kitchen for the first time. And the woman of the house allows herself, finally, one small luxury, which is to stand close to it for perhaps 30 seconds with her hands held out toward the heat before the rest of the morning's demands arrive. It does not last. It never lasts. Somewhere above her, a child has started to cry, the particular thin wail of a small person who has woken cold and confused in a dark room. And the morning, properly speaking, has begun. Water is the next problem, and water in 1850 London is its own enormous subject, one we could spend an entire evening on by itself. For now, simply know this: there is no tap in this kitchen that delivers hot water, and there may not be a tap at all in the way you would recognize one. Many houses of this class share a cold water supply that runs only at certain hours of the day, controlled by the water company according to a schedule that has nothing to do with when anyone actually needs water, and everything to do with the company's own convenience. If the woman of the house is fortunate, there is a butt or cistern that collects and holds water during the hours it runs, so that some is available even when the supply itself is shut off. If she is not fortunate, she times her mornings around the water company's schedule the way a sailor times a voyage around the tide, and woe betide the household that runs short on a morning when the water has already been turned off for the day. She fills a kettle from whatever water is available and sets it on the fire, which is now strong enough to be useful for something beyond simply existing. While it heats, she begins on what might generously be called breakfast. For a household like this one, breakfast is not an elaborate affair. Bread, usually bought the day before from a local baker, sometimes a day or two old by the time it is eaten, because fresh bread costs more, and a family watching every farthing learns quickly that yesterday's loaf toasted at the fire is nearly as good and considerably cheaper. Dripping, the rendered fat saved from whatever meat the household last managed to afford, spread on the bread in place of butter, which is a luxury reserved for better days or better households, perhaps a little butter on Sundays if things are going reasonably well. Tea, weak, stretched, the same leaves sometimes used twice, sweetened if sugar can be spared, and unsweetened if it cannot, taken without milk more often than with it, because milk in this part of London arrives by cart from dairies on the city's edges, and by the time it reaches a working family's table it has often turned, or very nearly, especially in summer, and a woman who has been caught out by sour milk once does not make the same mistake twice. The husband eats first, or at the same time as everyone else if the table is small enough that there is no meaningful difference, and he eats with one eye on the clock, because his employer does not care that the fire took 30 minutes to light, or that the water company had not yet turned the supply back on. He needs to be at his desk by a certain hour, and London's clerks, of which there are now tens of thousands, an entire new class of worker that did not really exist in anything like these numbers a generation earlier, understand with total clarity that lateness is one of the few sins their employers will not forgive twice. He is, let us say, a man of about 35, employed as a clerk for a firm involved in the shipping trade, a job that requires good handwriting, careful arithmetic, complete reliability, and a willingness to spend 10 or 11 hours a day at a high desk copying out letters and ledgers by hand, because the typewriter does not exist yet in any form that matters and will not for another 2 decades or more. His income places him in that strange, anxious territory the Victorians themselves were only just beginning to find a name for. Not poor exactly, not in the way the families in the worst parts of the East End are poor, but never far from it either, never more than a bad month or a sudden illness away from real trouble. He wears a coat that is brushed and mended rather than new. His collar is detachable and washed separately, because collars show dirt fastest, and a clean collar matters enormously to how respectable a man looks walking into his office, regardless of what is happening underneath it. He kisses his wife, perhaps, or perhaps simply nods to her, depending on how demonstrative this particular marriage tends to be, takes his hat and his small parcel of bread and cheese for the midday meal he will eat at his desk or nearby, and walks out into a London morning that is by this hour beginning to fill with smoke. Every chimney in every house on every street like his is doing exactly what his own chimney has just finished doing, and the cumulative effect, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of households burning coal for heat and cooking, is a haze that settles over the entire city most winter mornings, thick enough that by midday in a true fog, a person can sometimes barely see across the street. The Londoners of this era have a phrase for the worst of it. They call it a pea souper, on account of the colour, a yellowish-brown thickness that gets into clothes and lungs and the backs of throats, and that everyone, rich and poor alike, simply accepts as the cost of living in the largest, busiest, most industrially productive city the world has yet produced. In the house with 8 servants, breakfast looks almost nothing like this, and yet oddly it begins from a similar place, which is a household working very hard so that the family at its centre can appear to do very little. The breakfast room, by the time the family descends to it sometime after 8, is warm, properly warm. The fire that Sarah built before dawn now well established and glowing. The table is laid with a white cloth, and on it sits a spread that would represent, in terms of raw food cost alone, more than the clerk's family spends on food in the better part of a week. Eggs, several of them, prepared more than one way if the cook has had time and the household's habits run toward variety. Bacon, ham, perhaps both. Toast, made fresh and kept warm in a silver rack designed for exactly that purpose. The rack itself a small Victorian invention born from the very particular problem of how to keep toast crisp rather than soggy while it waits to be eaten. Cold meats, left over from the previous evening's dinner because a well-run kitchen wastes nothing it can possibly reuse. Marmalade and honey and proper butter, soft from sitting near the fire's edge, not the rationed dripping of 3 miles away but an actual dairy product, used freely, without the small mental arithmetic that governs every spoonful in the clerk's kitchen. Coffee for the master of the house if he prefers it to tea, brought to the table already made because the equipment and the skill required to make good coffee well in this period are both considerable, and few households below this income level bother with it at all. The family eats this meal together, mostly in a silence that would surprise people who imagine Victorian family life as endlessly chatty. Newspapers are common at the breakfast table among households of this kind, the master reading his with the kind of total absorption that makes conversation difficult, the children, if old enough, perhaps managing a sentence or two before being reminded, gently or otherwise, that breakfast is not the time for chatter. It is in its own way a strangely lonely meal despite the abundance on the table, several people sitting close together and saying very little, each privately occupied. The food itself almost incidental to the actual function of the gathering, which is simply to mark, formally, that the day has begun and the household is, once again, functioning correctly. None of the labour that produced this meal is visible at the table. The cook who rose before 5 to begin the bacon and the eggs, timing each element, so that everything would arrive at the table hot and ready at the precise moment the family chose to appear, which is itself never entirely predictable, and requires a particular kind of practiced anticipation. The kitchen maid who plucked and cleaned whatever needed plucking and cleaning, who hauled coal for the kitchen range that the cook needed roaring hot by 6 in the morning, who washed every pot and pan the moment it was set down so that the kitchen would not fall into the kind of chaos that ruins a meal's timing. The footman or the parlour maid who carried each dish up from the basement kitchen, through corridors specifically designed so that servants moving food and servants moving themselves would never be glimpsed by the family taking the same journey through the house's grander, visible spaces. This is one of the genuinely strange architectural facts of houses like this one. They are built quite deliberately with 2 parallel circulatory systems, one for the family and their guests, wide and well lit and handsomely decorated, and one for the people who keep the first one running, narrow and dim and entirely hidden, with separate staircases, separate doors, sometimes separate bells coded to ring in particular patterns so that a servant answering one knows exactly which room is summoning them without needing to ask. I find myself genuinely struck by that every time I come back to it, an entire second house, built inside the first one, invisible by design, existing purely so that the visible house can appear to run itself. The breakfast ends. The newspaper is folded. The master of the house, who is involved in business of some kind, perhaps shipping, perhaps banking, perhaps one of the newer manufacturing concerns that have made so many of the recent fortunes in this city, leaves for his office or his club or his various appointments, in a carriage if the household keeps one, which a family at this level very likely does, with a coachman whose own morning began even earlier than Sarah's, out in the cold of the mews, harnessing and feeding and grooming animals that need attending to regardless of the temperature or the hour. Back in the narrow house, the morning does not pause to admire itself the way the wealthy household's morning sometimes seems to. There is no newspaper moment, no quiet half-hour of coffee and toast and private thought. The moment the husband and any older children who work or attend school have gone out the door, the woman of the house turns to the day's actual labour, which has been waiting for her patiently the entire time she was occupied with fires and breakfast. The front step comes first, and I want to spend a moment on this, because it is one of those small details that tells you almost everything about how respectability actually functioned in this period. Nearly every house on a street like this one has a stone step at its front door, and nearly every woman responsible for that house scrubs that step most mornings, often with a damp cloth and a whitening agent called hearthstone, or sometimes simply a piece of soft donkey stone rubbed directly onto the wet step until it takes on a pale, chalky finish. This is not, strictly speaking, necessary for cleanliness in any practical sense. The step is stone, it is outdoors. Rain falls on it regularly, and would, left alone, keep it reasonably clean on its own. But a scrubbed, whitened front step is a public statement, visible to every neighbour and every passer-by, that the household behind that door, whatever its private struggles, keeps up appearances. A dirty step suggests a slovenly household, and a slovenly household is one small step, if you will forgive the phrase, from a household that has given up entirely, in a social world where the margin between respectable poverty and disreputable poverty is thinner than people often imagine and is policed relentlessly by exactly this kind of small visible detail. So she kneels on her own step in the cold most mornings and whitens it, and stands to check the effect from the street. And this happens on streets like this one all across London. Hundreds of women on hundreds of steps each performing the same small, slightly absurd, entirely necessary ritual before the day moves on to its next demand. That next demand depends heavily on which day of the week this is, because the Victorian working household runs on a weekly rhythm nearly as fixed as the church calendar. Monday, if this is Monday, means washing day. And washing day deserves its own honest accounting because it is, by general agreement among the women who lived through it and wrote about it afterward, the single hardest physical day of the entire week. There is no washing machine. There is a tub, often called a dolly tub, a large wooden or galvanized vessel into which water must first be heated, in batches, on the same coal fire that has already been doing double duty all morning. Soap, often homemade or bought cheaply in hard bars that need shaving and dissolving, is worked through the clothes by hand or with a wooden implement called a dolly or a pozzer, a kind of plunger with legs that the woman works up and down through the tub, agitating the fabric against the soapy water in motions that use the whole arm, the whole shoulder, repeated for as long as it takes to get genuinely dirty clothes genuinely clean, which on a household income that cannot afford to replace anything easily means working stains out rather than simply giving up on them. Then the rinsing in clean water, which means more water heated or at least more water hauled. Then the wringing by hand if there is no mangle, a task that leaves the hands raw and the forearms aching by the end of a full wash day. If the household is fortunate enough to own or borrow a mangle, a large device with two rollers that squeeze water from fabric as it is fed through by a hand crank, the work is somewhat easier, though feeding heavy wet sheets through a mangle's rollers while turning the crank with the other hand is its own particular skill, learned the hard way, often with pinched fingers along the way. Then hanging, which in a London winter presents its own special cruelty, because wet clothes hung outside in cold damp air do not dry so much as they simply hang there, increasingly cold and increasingly disheartening, sometimes for the better part of 2 days, while the household manages with fewer clean garments than it would like, and the kitchen, if the washing has to be hung indoors near the fire instead, fills with the particular damp, slightly sour smell of wet wool and linen steaming gently in an already cramped space. By the end of washing day, a woman's hands are typically red and cracked, the lye and cheap soap being no friend to skin that gets no rest from it, and her back aches in a specific, low, persistent way that every working woman of this era seems to describe in almost identical terms when asked, which tells you something about how universal this particular suffering was. And washing day, brutal as it is simply one day among 7, slotted in alongside everything else that still needs doing regardless of what day it happens to be. Washing day exists in the grand house too, but it exists somewhere else entirely, both physically and socially. A household at this level either keeps a dedicated laundry maid, whose entire job, day in and day out, is exactly the labour we just described, performed in a laundry room set well apart from the rest of the house, sometimes in a separate building behind the main one, so that the steam and the smell and the visible drudgery of it never reaches the family's actual living space, or it sends its washing out entirely to a commercial laundress. A woman who takes in linens from several wealthy households and does this same back-breaking work on their behalf in her own home or workshop for a fee that the grand household pays without a second thought, and the laundress earns through exactly the kind of labor we just spent several minutes describing. Either way, the lady of this house has never once in her entire adult life put her own hands into a tub of cold, soapy water and worked a stain out of linen with her own knuckles. She would not know how, not really, not with any practical skill, even if you asked her to try. This is not a criticism of her so much as an observation about how completely class in this period determines which kinds of bodily knowledge a person ends up carrying. The clerk's wife knows the precise temperature water needs to be for different fabrics, knows which stains lift with cold water and which need heat, knows exactly how long to leave something soaking before the effort becomes wasted time. The lady of the grand house knows none of this, and does not need to. And the gap between these two bodies of knowledge, one purely practical and hard one, the other simply absent because it was never required, is as real a difference between these two women as the difference in their bank accounts. So what does she do with her morning, this lady of the grand house, while Sarah and the laundry maid and the cook keep the building running beneath and around her? The honest answer is that she works too, just at an entirely different kind of labor, one that the period itself refused to call work at all. She has correspondence, and a surprising amount of it. Letters to write, to family, to friends, to acquaintances whose social standing needs to be maintained through exactly this kind of regular, careful attention, because in a world without telephones, a friendship or a useful connection that is not actively maintained through letters tends to quietly wither. She has calls to plan, the elaborate Victorian system of visiting in which a lady of her standing is expected to call upon other ladies of similar or slightly higher standing during specific afternoon hours, leaving a small printed calling card if the lady of the house is not receiving or being received properly, with tea and conversation if she is. The rules governing exactly who calls on whom first, in what order, with what frequency, and what it means if a call is not returned within a proper interval, form an entire unspoken etiquette that a woman in her position is expected to simply know, absorbed over years of observation and correction, the way a clerk's wife absorbs the precise rhythm of getting a fire lit in under 20 minutes. She might spend part of her morning at needlework, not from any practical necessity, since the household can certainly afford to buy whatever it needs, but because fine needlework is one of the few forms of visible, demonstrable accomplishment available to a lady of leisure, evidence of patience and taste, and an idle hour well spent on something delicate. She might read, if she is inclined that way, a novel or perhaps something more improving, depending on her own temperament and how closely she hews to the period's expectations of feminine seriousness. She consults with the housekeeper, a conversation that happens most mornings and that represents in its own quiet way the actual administrative center of this entire household. The housekeeper, a woman typically older, often unmarried or widowed, holding a position of real authority within the house's invisible second structure, manages the household accounts, the ordering of supplies, the hiring and supervision of the female servants beneath her, and the endless small decisions about linens and provisions and schedules that keep a house of this size functioning. She and the lady of the house meet most mornings to go over the day's requirements, and this meeting, brief as it might be, 15 minutes, perhaps 20, is in practice where most of the real management of the household happens, even though the lady of the house will later, at her own dinner parties, speak of her home running itself with the kind of effortless grace that good breeding apparently confers. It does not run itself. It runs on the housekeeper's ledgers and Sarah's aching knees and the cook's relentless internal clock, and the lady's own contribution, while real, is largely confined to oversight, taste, and the social performance that converts all of this invisible labor into visible status. By late morning, the clerk's wife is out of the house again, this time with a basket over one arm, because food in 1850 London is almost entirely a daily transaction rather than a weekly one. There is no refrigeration in any form a modern person would recognize. A household might have a cool larder, ideally on the north side of the house, away from direct sun, perhaps with a stone shelf that holds temperature slightly better than the rest of the kitchen, and in winter the outside air itself does a fair amount of the work simply by being cold. But meat bought today needs to be eaten within a day or two at most. Milk needs to be used the same day it arrives or sacrificed to the inevitable souring. And so a woman in her position shops constantly, almost daily, threading her way through streets that are themselves an entire sensory experience worth pausing on. The street outside her door is not quiet. London in this period is loud in a way that takes most modern visitors by surprise when they read accurate descriptions of it, full of cartwheels grinding over cobblestones, the cries of street sellers calling out what they have for sale in a kind of musical shorthand specific to each trade, the muffin man's bell, the costermonger's particular sing-song cry advertising vegetables from a barrow, the rag and bone man's call, 100 small businesses conducted entirely on foot and entirely out loud because that is how you reach customers in a city without any other form of advertising reaching down to street level. She buys bread from the baker if she has not made her own, a possibility for some households though increasingly less common as commercial bakeries spread and the convenience, despite the cost, becomes hard to resist. She buys whatever vegetables are in season and affordable, which in winter narrows considerably, mostly to things that store reasonably well: potatoes, onions, the hardier roots, with fresh green vegetables, a genuine summer luxury that disappears almost entirely for months at a stretch. She buys a small amount of meat if the week's budget allows it, often the cheaper cuts, the ones requiring long, slow cooking to render them edible, or sometimes simply bones, bought cheaply from the butcher specifically to make a broth that can stretch a very small amount of actual meat across several meals' worth of flavour. The arithmetic of all of this happens constantly in her head as she walks, a continuous low hum of calculation that never really stops for a woman managing a household on a clerk's wages. This costs this much. We have this much left until Friday. If I buy this, we cannot have that. It is exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with physical labour and everything to do with the particular fatigue of constant low-grade financial vigilance, the kind that wealthier households simply never have to practice because the answer to nearly every question of this is more than ample. Can it be afforded is simply yes, without the question needing to be seriously asked at all. She returns home with her basket, and the midday meal for a household like hers is often the most substantial meal of the day, at least for the working members of the family, a habit inherited from an older agricultural rhythm where the heaviest meal traditionally came at midday to fuel an afternoon of physical labour. For her husband, working at his desk rather than in a field, the timing has become slightly less practical, but the habit persists anyway, as habits do. If he can get home for it, which depends entirely on how far his office is and how strict his employer's expectations are about lunch hours, he might eat a proper midday dinner of meat if there is any, potatoes, bread, perhaps a simple pudding if there is time and ingredients to spare. If he cannot get home, he eats whatever he carried with him that morning. Bread and cheese most likely, eaten quickly at his desk, or standing in a nearby coffee house that caters specifically to clerks who need something quick and cheap between the hours their employer permits. In the grand house, luncheon is a lighter meal than breakfast or dinner, almost deliberately so, a kind of pause built into the day's rhythm rather than a meal meant to fuel real exertion, because real physical exertion is not, generally speaking, something the lady of this house or her female guests are expected to perform. Cold meats again perhaps, left over from the previous evening, a little soup, bread, fruit if it is in season, or if the household's resources stretch to the kind of forced or imported fruit that lets a wealthy table enjoy strawberries considerably outside their natural English season, grown in heated glass houses by gardeners whose skill in coaxing fruit out of season is its own quiet, expensive art form most people never think about. Afternoon, for a lady of this standing, belongs largely to the elaborate social choreography of calling. This is worth slowing down on, because it sounds, described baldly, like a simple matter of visiting friends, and it is in fact one of the most rigidly coded social systems of the entire Victorian period, full of rules that a woman either absorbs correctly through years of careful observation or violates, sometimes without even realizing it, with real social consequences. Calls happen by convention in the afternoon, despite being called morning calls in the slightly confusing terminology of the period, a holdover from an earlier era when the social day simply ran on a different schedule. A lady wishing to call announces her arrival, if her acquaintance is a close one, simply by coming to the door, but if the acquaintance is more formal, by sending a servant ahead first, or by presenting a card at the door and waiting to see whether the lady of that house is, in the period's specific phrase, at home. Being at home, crucially, does not always mean physically present. A lady might be sitting in her drawing room at that exact moment and still send word, through her own servant, that she is not at home, a polite and universally understood way of declining a visit without the bluntness of an outright refusal. Everyone understands the fiction, everyone participates in it anyway, because the alternative, actual direct refusal, would cause far more social friction than a small, agreed-upon lie everybody recognizes as exactly that. If she is properly received, tea is brought, conversation happens, lasting perhaps 15 or 20 minutes, rarely much longer unless the relationship is unusually close, because overstaying a call is its own small social error, and then the visiting lady moves on, sometimes to 2 or 3 more calls in the same afternoon, working her way through a mental list of obligations that she tracks as carefully, in her own way, as the clerk's wife tracks her household budget. Calls must be returned within a certain interval. Failing to return a call within that window sends a message, intended or not, about how the relationship is regarded. A new acquaintance, recently arrived in the neighborhood or recently married into it, must be called upon by the established ladies of the area, and the order in which this happens, who calls on whom first, says something quiet but unmistakable about relative social standing. None of this is written down anywhere as formal law. All of it is understood completely by every woman raised within this world, and violated, when it is violated, almost always by someone genuinely new to it. An American heiress recently married into English society, say, or a wife whose husband's money is newer than his manners, learning these rules the hard way through small, cutting social corrections that are never quite explained directly but are nonetheless perfectly clear in their meaning. I want to be honest with you about something here. It is easy to make this all sound faintly ridiculous. An entire afternoon spent on cards and tea and 15-minute visits governed by unwritten law, and in some ways it is exactly that. But it is also, underneath the apparent triviality, genuinely serious work. The connections a woman maintains through this constant calling are the connections that will get her children invited to the right gatherings when they come of age, that will secure her husband's standing in circles where business and social life are barely distinguishable from one another, that will determine in very real practical terms the family's trajectory across the coming decades. She is not wasting her afternoon. She is investing it carefully in a currency that does not show up on any bank statement, but matters every bit as much as money in determining how this family's life unfolds. There is a third household worth pausing on here, because London in 1850 is full of them, and they sit in a strange, uncomfortable middle ground between the two lives we have been following so far. This is the household that keeps exactly one servant, a single young woman, usually somewhere between 13 and 20 years old, known throughout the period by the plain, almost brutal job title of maid of all work, because that is precisely and literally what the position requires. Not a housemaid who handles cleaning and leaves cooking to a cook, not a kitchen maid who handles food and leaves the front rooms to someone else. All of it. Every task that in the grand house is divided carefully among 8 different specialized servants, performed here by one exhausted girl, for wages that are barely enough to justify the position existing at all, in a household whose mistress, the wife of a slightly better paid clerk or a small shopkeeper or a minor professional man, hovers somewhere just above the line that separates respectable struggle from outright poverty, and is determined, with something close to desperation, to stay on the correct side of it. Maybe she is 14, this girl. Well, she might tell you she is 14, though the truth, for a girl this age trying to secure a position, sometimes bends a year or two in whichever direction seems most useful. Fresh from a rural family that could not feed all of its children, and sent the eldest daughter to London with a small box of belongings and a letter of reference from the local vicar. Maybe she is older, having drifted through 2 or 3 similar positions already, each one ending for reasons that were never entirely her fault, and were never entirely explained to her either. She lights the fires, all of them, in a house with perhaps 3 or 4 rooms that need fires at all. She fetches the water, hauls the coal, scrubs the front step exactly the way the clerk's wife scrubs her own, blacks the grates, washes the dishes, cooks the meals under the close and often anxious supervision of a mistress who is herself only barely confident in her own management of a household, and who takes that anxiety out, sometimes gently and sometimes not, on the one young person beneath her who has even less power than she does. She sleeps, more often than not, in the kitchen itself, on a truckle bed pulled out at night and pushed away each morning, or in a tiny box room barely large enough for a narrow bed frame, tucked under the eaves where the roof slopes too low for an adult to stand fully upright. Her wages might come to perhaps £8 or £10 a year, paid quarterly if she is fortunate enough to work for an employer who pays reliably, along with her food and that cramped sleeping space, which her employers genuinely consider, and which she is expected to genuinely consider too, a fair exchange for roughly 14 or 15 hours of labour most days, beginning before the family wakes and ending only once the last dish is washed and the last fire banked for the night. The mistress of this household occupies an odd position of her own, one that the wealthier ladies a few streets over would scarcely recognize as belonging to the same broad category as their own lives, despite both being, in the loosest possible sense, women who do not work for wages. She supervises rather than performs, in theory, the way the lady of the grand house supervises her housekeeper, but the gap between supervision and labour in a household with exactly one servant is razor thin. If the maid is ill, the mistress cooks. If the maid is overwhelmed, the mistress scrubs alongside her. There is no understaffed margin here the way there might be, briefly, in a house with 8 people sharing the load. There is one girl, and one mistress watching anxiously over her, and a household reputation for respectability that depends entirely on both of them managing, somehow every single day, to make a 4-room house look and run like a small, dignified, properly conducted establishment on an income that leaves almost nothing left over once the rent and the food and the coal and the maid's modest wages are all accounted for. I find this particular arrangement genuinely poignant, more than either of the 2 extremes we have spent more time on tonight. The grand household's inequality is enormous, but at least in its own way stable, cushioned by real money on every side. The single fully working-class household's poverty is severe, but at least in some sense honestly named, with nobody pretending otherwise. The one-servant household lives in a kind of constant, quiet performance of respectability that could collapse at any moment, a single missed rent payment or a single serious illness away from sliding down into the kind of poverty its mistress spends every waking hour trying to hold at bay, for herself and for the exhausted young girl sleeping in her kitchen, both of them caught in the same precarious structure, however differently they each experience it. If you walked across the city on this particular afternoon, on through the wide streets near Hyde Park, you would have seen something that would not have meant much to most ordinary Londoners going about their business yet, but that historians now point to as one of the defining symbols of exactly this moment in the city's life. Iron and glass, an enormous quantity of both, being assembled into a structure unlike anything London had built before, intended to house an exhibition the following year that the organisers were calling, with characteristic Victorian confidence, a celebration of the works of industry of all nations. The Crystal Palace, as people would soon start calling it, was still rising out of the park that autumn, a glittering skeleton of a building that seemed even half finished, to promise something about the era's appetite for progress, for display, for the idea that human ingenuity, properly organized and properly exhibited, could be gathered under one enormous glass roof for the whole world to walk through and admire. The clerk walking past it on his way to the docks might have glanced up at it the way you glance at construction you do not fully understand the purpose of yet. The lady of the grand house, riding past it in her carriage, might have already secured, through one of her many careful social connections, an assurance that her family would have tickets to the opening when it finally came. Neither of them in 1850 could have fully predicted what an enormous event it would become, but there it was already, taking shape above the bare winter trees of the park, a quiet signal that something about this city's idea of itself was shifting, even as the daily business of fires and dinners and calling cards carried on completely unchanged beneath it. Back in the grand house's kitchen, the afternoon has its own gravity entirely separate from anything happening in the ladies' drawing room above. If this is a day with guests expected for dinner, and in a household at this level it very often is, the cook's afternoon is governed by a kind of controlled urgency that anyone who has worked in a professional kitchen in any era would recognize instantly. The kitchen itself is hot, properly hot, in a way the rest of the house, drafty and inconsistently heated, simply is not. A large range fed constantly with coal throws off heat that makes the basement kitchen the warmest room in the entire building most days, a small irony that the servants who work there are well aware of even as they sweat through the labor of it. The cook, who in a household of this standing might be a woman with real professional standing of her own, sometimes trained in a great country house before coming to London, sometimes simply gifted with years of accumulated skill and no formal training at all, oversees the kitchen maid and sometimes a scullery maid beneath that, the lowest position in the entire household's hierarchy, responsible for the dirtiest and most physically punishing tasks, scrubbing pots blackened by the range's constant heat, plucking and gutting whatever fowl or game the meal requires, hauling coal up from the cellar to keep the range fed, washing vegetables in water that is, by the end of a long afternoon, distinctly less than clean. A dinner for guests at this level of society might run to 8 or 10 separate courses, soup, fish, an entree of some smaller dish, a main remove of roasted meat, game if it is the season, vegetables prepared separately and elaborately, a sweet course, savouries, cheese, fruit, each one requiring its own preparation, its own precise timing, its own particular dishes and serving pieces that must be clean and ready at exactly the moment they are needed. The cook coordinates all of this from memory and instinct because written recipes in this period function more as general guidance than precise instruction, the actual execution depending heavily on a cook's accumulated sense of timing and proportion built up over years of doing this exact kind of work under exactly this kind of pressure. Let us slow down here for a moment. There is a detail about light itself, about the simple question of how a room gets lit once the sun goes down, that runs underneath everything else we have talked about tonight, and it deserves its own quiet attention. In the clerk's narrow house, light after dark comes mostly from tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, cheap enough to be within reach of a household like this one, but far from pleasant by any sensory measure. They smoke faintly as they burn. They smell, not unbearably, but noticeably, a low greasy undertone that settles into curtains and clothing over time the way coal smoke does. They gutter in drafts, which a house like this one has no shortage of, and they need trimming periodically. The burnt wick snipped back with a small pair of scissors kept for exactly that purpose, or the flame grows smoky and uneven and the light it gives dims rather than brightens. A single tallow candle gives off a small, warm, slightly unsteady pool of light, perhaps enough to read by if you hold the page close, perhaps enough to sew by if your eyes are young and sharp, and definitely not enough to do both comfortably for very long without strain. And candles cost money, real money, money that competes directly with bread and coal and rent in a household budget that has very little slack anywhere in it. So light in this house, after dark, is rationed the way everything else is rationed. One candle, maybe two, burning in whichever room the family is actually using, and an early bedtime not entirely because anyone is especially tired yet, but because staying up later than necessary simply costs more than the household can easily justify. 3 miles away in the grand house, the calculation is entirely different, though the underlying physics of fire and wax have not changed at all. Wax candles, considerably more expensive than tallow and considerably more pleasant in every sensory way, burn cleaner, brighter, with almost no smell at all beyond a faint, warm sweetness. Some rooms in the grandest London houses by this point in the century have begun installing gas lighting, a genuinely new technology still working its way through the city's wealthier neighbourhoods, piped in from street mains that already light many of London's main thoroughfares after dark with a steady, somewhat harsh, blue-white glow that strikes most contemporary observers as either thrillingly modern or faintly unnatural, sometimes both at once. A drawing room lit by gas, or by a sufficient quantity of good wax candles arranged in proper silver candlesticks and chandeliers, produces a kind of light that the clerk's wife would scarcely recognize from her own evenings, bright enough to read fine print across a room, bright enough to make jewellery and silk genuinely sparkle in a way that flatters every surface it touches, bright enough that an entire evening of cards or music or conversation can unfold without anyone giving the cost of the light itself a single thought. That last part is, I think, the real difference worth sitting with. It is not really about brightness in the end. It is about whether the question of cost ever enters your mind at all. In one house, every candle lit is a small conscious decision, weighed however briefly against everything else that candles cost could have bought instead. In the other house, light simply happens, abundant and unconsidered, the way air simply happens, and the absence of that small mental calculation, repeated every single evening across an entire lifetime, is its own kind of privilege, quieter and less visible than carriages or jewels, but every bit as real. The afternoon in the narrow house moves slowly and does not move slowly at all. Both at once, the strange way time behaves when a person is genuinely busy but the tasks themselves are quiet, repetitive, unhurried in their texture even as they fill every available minute. There is mending. There is almost always mending. A shirt with a collar gone thin at the fold, a stocking with a heel worn through to something close to lace, a child's jacket that needs letting out at the shoulders again because the boy underneath it will simply not stop growing no matter how carefully his mother has budgeted for the next size up. She sits near the window in whatever light the London afternoon offers, which on a clear day is a pale, low, slightly golden light that moves slowly across the floor as the hours pass, and on a grey day, which is more common than not, is simply a dim, even, shadowless grey that makes fine needlework genuinely difficult, and gives her a headache by the time the light fails entirely sometime in mid-afternoon during the worst of winter. The needle goes in, the needle comes out. The thread pulls through with a small, specific sound, a tiny whisper of friction against fabric that becomes, over years of this exact task, so familiar it barely registers as sound at all anymore, simply part of the background texture of an ordinary afternoon. A child plays somewhere nearby, on the floor, with whatever small toy has survived long enough to still be playable with, a wooden horse missing one ear, a rag doll gone grey and soft from years of handling. She glances over periodically the way mothers do, not really watching so much as simply maintaining a constant low-level awareness that lets her know, without quite looking, exactly where the child is and what kind of trouble, if any, that child is currently capable of getting into. If there is time, and there often is not, but if there is, she might manage a cup of tea herself sometime in the mid-afternoon, the same stretched, twice-used leaves from the morning, the water reheated on a fire that has by now settled into a steady, manageable burn rather than the fragile new thing it was at 5 in the morning. She drinks it standing more often than not because sitting properly to drink a cup of tea feels, on a day like this, like an indulgence she has not quite earned yet, with so much of the day's work still ahead of her. The light fails. It fails earlier than you might expect, especially in winter, sometime well before 4 in the afternoon. The sky outside her window sliding from grey to a deeper, bruised grey to something closer to true dark, and the fire she lit before dawn becomes, once again, the most important thing in the room, its light now doing double duty for warmth and for sight both. She lights one candle carefully, conscious of how much of it she is using and how much remains for the evening ahead, and the small orange glow it throws joins the firelight in making the kitchen feel, for a little while, almost cozy, almost like a place where the day's hardships have been, if not erased, at least temporarily set down. Her husband returns sometime after 6, tired in the particular way that a long day of close, careful, repetitive work tires a person. His eyes strained from hours of small handwriting under indifferent office lighting, his collar slightly less crisp than it was that morning, his feet sore from the walk home through streets that are by this hour thick with the day's accumulated coal smoke and the particular damp chill that London evenings specialise in. He sits gratefully in the chair nearest the fire, and for a moment, just a moment, before the evening's own small demands begin, the household settles into something close to peace. Supper, for this household, is simple, almost always, a smaller echo of the midday meal if there was meat to spare, or bread and cheese again if there was not, eaten at a small table pulled close to the fire because the rest of the kitchen, by evening, has surrendered most of its warmth back to the cold London night pressing in against the windows. There is conversation, the ordinary, unremarkable conversation of a family at the end of an ordinary day. What happened at the office, what the children did. A small piece of neighbourhood news passed along the street earlier, and now passed along the table. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would survive being written down anywhere except, perhaps, in a private journal kept by someone unusually reflective, and even then only barely, the way most ordinary days from any era tend to slip past unrecorded simply because nobody living through them thinks to call them remarkable. After supper, if there is a little daylight left in the candle and a little energy left in the body, there might be reading aloud if someone in the household reads well, and the family can afford the small luxury of a book or a borrowed newspaper, the husband perhaps reading out some item from that day's paper, a piece of parliamentary news, a notice about the great exhibition rising in the park, a report of some crime or scandal that has caught the city's attention, while his wife continues mending in the dim light, and the children listen with the particular drowsy half-attention of young people who are tired without quite knowing they are tired yet. Or there might simply be quiet, the fire settling and popping gently in the grate, everyone present but not especially talkative, worn down by a day that asked a great deal of all of them and gave back, in honest material terms, very little in return. Bedtime comes early in a household like this, not from any particular virtue but from simple practicality. Staying up costs candle and coal that the next day's needs will miss. The children are taken up first, tucked under whatever blankets the house possesses, perhaps with a stone hot water bottle or a wrapped brick warmed at the fire and slid down near their feet if the night is especially bitter. The parents follow not long after, the fire banked down to a low, slow-burning pile of coal that will, with luck, still hold a few embers by morning, embers the wife will rake through tomorrow before 5 and use to coax tomorrow's fire into being just a little faster than today's, if she is fortunate. Though fortune, in matters like this, has a way of being unreliable. In the grand house, the hour that the clerk's family spends quietly eating supper by a dying fire is, for the household across town, one of the most demanding stretches of the entire day, because tonight, as it happens, there are guests coming for dinner, 10 of them, and an evening like this does not simply arrive. It is built piece by piece over several hours, by a great many hands working in careful, practiced coordination. The lady of the house begins dressing around 6, a full 90 minutes or more before her guests are expected, because dressing for a dinner of this importance is not something accomplished quickly. Her maid has already laid out the gown chosen for tonight, something in a deep jewel tone, perhaps a wine-coloured silk, chosen weeks ago and confirmed again only yesterday once the guest list was finalized, and the lady had a chance to consider who else would be present and what impression exactly she wishes to create among them. The corset comes first, laced firmly though not, in a well-run household, laced to the point of genuine pain, despite what popular imagination sometimes assumes about Victorian fashion. Then the layers beneath the gown itself, a chemise, perhaps a crinoline or its earlier cousin, structures designed to give the skirt its proper fashionable shape. A shape that has nothing whatsoever to do with comfort and everything to do with silhouette, with how the gown will move and catch candlelight as she crosses a room later this evening. Her hair takes the better part of an hour on its own, her maid working through an elaborate arrangement of curls and braids, pinning in small ornaments, perhaps fresh flowers sent up from the kitchen garden if the season allows, perhaps simply ribbon and combs if it does not. Jewellery comes last, chosen with real deliberation, not too much, which would read as ostentatious among her particular circle, and not too little either, which would suggest the family's fortunes have suffered some recent reverse that everyone would immediately begin speculating about. A necklace, perhaps, that belonged to her own mother, earrings to match, a single bracelet, the whole effect calculated to the smallest visible detail, because every woman at tonight's table will notice everything, will discuss it quietly tomorrow over their own afternoon calls, and will draw small but real conclusions about the family's taste, wealth, and standing from exactly these choices. Downstairs, the kitchen has reached its own particular fever pitch. The cook, who has been building toward this exact hour since early afternoon, now moves through her final preparations with the controlled intensity of someone who has done this exact dance many times before and knows precisely how little margin for error remains. The soup needs to be hot but not yet served, held at the correct temperature on the edge of the range. The fish course needs its sauce finished at the last possible moment, so it does not separate or cool before it reaches the table. The roast, the centerpiece of the meal, has been resting, its juices settling, timed with real precision so that it reaches the table at the exact peak of doneness, rather than a moment too early, which would mean carving it raw at the table in front of guests, or a moment too late, which would mean serving meat gone grey and tough from overcooking, while everyone politely pretends not to notice. The dining room itself has been transformed over the course of the afternoon by the parlour maid and the footman, the table laid with a precision that took the better part of an hour on its own, linen perfectly pressed and perfectly aligned, silver polished to a particular gleam earlier that day by someone whose entire job, among several others, includes exactly this kind of careful, repetitive maintenance. Glasses arranged in the correct sequence for however many wines tonight's meal will involve. Place cards set out according to a seating plan the lady of the house worked out days ago, with real strategic thought given to who should sit beside whom, which conversations might productively happen, and which combinations of guests might, if seated too close together, produce an evening's worth of awkward silence or, worse, open disagreement. The guests begin arriving a little after 7:30, carriages pulling up one after another outside the tall white front of the house, each arrival announced by the particular sound of horses' hooves slowing on the street and a carriage door opening and closing, footmen stepping forward to help ladies down without catching their elaborate skirts on the carriage steps. A small choreography repeated identically outside grand houses all across this part of London on any evening when society gathers for dinner. Inside, the drawing room receives them first, warm, brightly lit, the fire built up generously for tonight specifically, candles or gas burning steadily enough to make every silk and every jewel in the room catch and hold the light. Conversation here is light, deliberately so, an easy social warm-up before the more substantial business of dinner itself. Comments on the weather, on a recent concert, on some piece of news currently circulating through this particular social world, delivered with the kind of practiced ease that comes from a lifetime spent doing exactly this, filling exactly this kind of room with exactly this kind of pleasant, low-stakes talk. When dinner is announced, the procession into the dining room follows its own strict order. the most senior or most honoured guests leading, paired off according to rank and precedence in a system that every person in the room understands instinctively and that would take an outsider considerable study to fully grasp. The host leads the most important lady present, the hostess follows on the arm of the most important gentleman. Everyone else falls into place behind them in an order that has been quietly calculated days in advance, and that nobody at the table will openly discuss, but everyone will silently register. The meal itself unfolds across an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours, course after course arriving and departing with a rhythm managed entirely by the footman and the parlour maid, moving quietly around the table, removing plates from the left, serving from the right, refilling glasses without ever quite interrupting the flow of conversation. A constant, careful, almost invisible choreography happening at the exact edge of the diner's attention. The soup comes first, taken in relative quiet as everyone settles properly into the evening. Then fish, then the smaller entree dish, then the main course, the roast, carved at a side table by the butler with the kind of precise, practiced skill that makes the whole process look effortless despite requiring genuine expertise. Vegetables in their own elaborate preparations, a different wine poured for nearly every course, each one chosen specifically to complement what is being served, a sweet course to follow, savouries after that for those who prefer something less rich to close the meal, and finally cheese and fruit, by which point the conversation has usually loosened considerably, the early formality of the evening giving way to something a little warmer, a little more genuine, as good food and good wine tend, in any era, to eventually produce. The conversation itself ranges across politics, mild and careful politics suitable for mixed company, across art and music and the upcoming exhibition that everyone in this room has heard about and most have already secured tickets for, across the various small dramas of their shared social world, who has become engaged, whose fortunes seem to be rising, who seem, more quietly and more carefully discussed, to be in some difficulty. There is wit here, genuine wit sometimes, and genuine warmth between people who have known each other for years and genuinely enjoy one another's company beneath all the formality. It is not, despite everything we have said about its performative qualities, an entirely hollow evening. People are, underneath the structure, actually connecting with one another, actually enjoying themselves, even as every single element of how that enjoyment is delivered to them has been built, hour by careful hour, by people they will never think to thank. After dinner, by custom, the ladies withdraw to the drawing-room, leaving the gentlemen at the table with their port and their cigars, and whatever conversation men of this period consider unsuitable for mixed company, a separation that strikes most modern observers as faintly absurd, but that everyone in this room accepts as simply how an evening like this proceeds. The ladies talk among themselves, more freely in some ways than they could at the mixed table, before the gentlemen eventually rejoin them for coffee, perhaps some music, the lady of the house or one of her more accomplished female guests playing something on the piano while the rest of the company listens, or pretends to listen, with the polite half-attention that drawing-room music performances have probably always received from at least some portion of any audience gathered to hear them. Below all of this, in the kitchen and the servants' hall, an entirely different evening is unfolding at the exact same hour, one that the guests upstairs never glimpse and rarely think about at all. The cook, who has been on her feet since before 5 that morning, finally gets a chance to eat something herself only once the main courses have gone up and the worst of the pressure has eased. A hurried plate taken standing at the kitchen table, eaten quickly between checking on the sweet course and making sure the savouries are ready in time. The kitchen maid and the scullery maid are deep into the washing up by now, an enormous quantity of pots and pans and serving dishes, accumulating faster than 2 pairs of hands can really keep pace with, water heated again and again on a range that has not had a genuine rest since before dawn, hands reddened and creased from hours spent in water that long ago stopped being anything close to comfortable. The footman and the parlour maid move constantly between the dining room above and the kitchen below, carrying trays, returning with empty dishes, snatching what brief moments of stillness the gaps between courses allow, standing quietly against a wall or just outside the door, listening for the particular sounds that signal when the next course should arrive. A fork set down, a certain shift in the room's conversational rhythm that experienced servants learn to read almost without consciously trying. It is exhausting work, less physically brutal than the cooks or the kitchen maids perhaps, but demanding in its own way, requiring a kind of constant low-level vigilance that never quite lets up across an entire long evening. Sarah, the housemaid we met before dawn this morning, has long since finished her visible duties for the day and is occupied now with less visible ones, turning down beds in the rooms upstairs that will not be used again tonight by anyone except the family themselves once their guests have gone, warming the family's own bedsheets with a pan of coals run quickly between the layers, making sure candles and matches are placed exactly where each family member expects to find them, small invisible preparations for an end to the evening that the family will experience as simply happening correctly, the way the morning's fires simply happened correctly, without any thought given to the hands that made it so. The guests begin departing sometime around 11, carriages summoned, farewells exchanged in the front hall, with the particular warmth that good food, good wine, and several pleasant hours together tend to produce, promises made to call again soon, to return the invitation, small social debts noted and filed away for future repayment. By the time the last carriage pulls away into the dark street, it is well past 11:30, and the lady and gentleman of the house, tired now in a different way than the clerk's family was tired hours earlier, climb the stairs to bedrooms that Sarah has already warmed and prepared, while below them, in the kitchen and the servants' hall, the cleaning continues for at least another hour, sometimes two, every dish washed, every surface wiped down, every piece of silver accounted for and locked away before anyone below stairs is finally permitted to consider their own day complete. There is a part of this story we have not properly entered yet, and it deserves its own quiet space tonight, because the children in both of these households are living lives every bit as shaped by class as their parents are, often in ways that are even harder to see clearly from this distance. In the narrow terrace house, the children's days are governed by whatever combination of school, work, and household help the family can manage. By 1850, the idea of universal schooling for working-class children is still developing, still patchy, still dependent heavily on charitable and religious institutions rather than any guaranteed state provision. A boy in this family might attend a local school run by a church, paying a small weekly fee the family can barely spare, learning his letters and his numbers in a single crowded room alongside dozens of other children of wildly varying ages, taught by a single overworked schoolmaster or schoolmistress doing their genuine best with resources that never quite stretch far enough. He might attend only irregularly, pulled out for weeks at a time whenever the family needs the few extra pence his labour, running errands or helping at a local shop, can bring in instead. A girl in this same family is, more likely than her brother, kept home to help her mother, learning the household skills that will define most of her own adult life long before she learns very much else. Her education in reading and writing often considerably thinner than her brother's, not from any single deliberate decision but from 1,000 small daily choices about whose time is more urgently needed, where. 3 miles away, in the grand house, the children's days look almost unrecognisably different, and yet share, underneath the surface, a similar quality of being shaped by forces well beyond their own control. The younger children spend most of their time in the nursery, a set of rooms set apart from the rest of the house, under the care of a nurse, sometimes assisted by an under-nursemaid, who manages their meals, their naps, their small daily routines, and who sees them, in practical terms, considerably more hours of the day than their own mother does. This is not considered neglect by the standards of this household or this era. It is simply how children of this class are raised, with the nursery functioning almost as its own small self-contained world, the children brought down to see their parents for a short, carefully managed visit some afternoons, dressed in their best on their best behaviour, for perhaps half an hour before being returned upstairs again. As they grow older, a governess typically arrives for the daughters, a woman in one of the period's strangest social positions, educated enough and genteel enough to be considered a suitable companion and teacher for the family's children, and yet employed, paid, and therefore not quite a member of the family at all, occupying an uncomfortable middle space between the family upstairs and the servants below, never entirely belonging to either world. She teaches French, music, drawing, a little history and geography, the particular curriculum considered appropriate for producing an accomplished young lady rather than an educated one in any deeper sense. The distinction mattering enormously to how this society understands what women are for. The sons, when old enough, are typically sent away to school entirely, a boarding school that will shape the rest of their lives through the connections and habits formed there every bit as much as through anything actually taught in the classroom. Neither childhood, the working child's early labour, or the wealthy child's distant, managed upbringing would strike a modern parent as obviously preferable to the other, and I think that is worth sitting with rather than resolving too neatly. The working class child gains a kind of early competence, a closeness to real domestic skill and real family need, at the cost of almost no leisure and very little formal education. The wealthy child gains security, comfort, and eventually genuine education, at the cost of something harder to name precisely, a kind of emotional distance from his or her own parents, that the period simply accepted as normal, and that later generations would come to see very differently. Sunday breaks the week's rhythm for both households, though it breaks it in different ways and to different degrees, and it is worth pausing on before we let the day we have been following finally slide toward night. For the Clark's family, Sunday means church, almost without question, the entire family dressed in whatever their best clothes happen to be, walking together to a local parish church or, depending on the family's particular religious leanings, perhaps a nonconformist chapel instead, where the service stretches on for a good while, the sermon often lengthy by modern standards, the congregation a genuine cross-section of the local neighbourhood, the wealthier families from nearby streets occupying their own paid pews near the front, the Clark's family and others like them seated further back, a small but unmistakable echo, even inside a place of worship, of the social ordering that governs nearly every other space in this city. After church, Sunday dinner is, if the week's budget has allowed any saving toward it at all, the single best meal of the week, a proper joint of meat if it can possibly be managed, the family lingering over it a little longer than usual, the afternoon that follows genuinely quieter than any other afternoon in the week, a small, hard-won pocket of rest in a life that otherwise allows for very little of it. For the family in the grand house, Sunday means church too, though the experience differs in nearly every visible particular. The family attends a fashionable church in their own neighbourhood, in their own reserved family pew, paid for annually as a kind of subscription that quietly reinforces, through architecture and seating alone, the same social hierarchy that organises the rest of their week. They are seen there, and being seen matters, the congregation functioning as much as a social occasion as a religious one, with conversations afterward on the church steps serving as their own small extension of the calling and visiting that fills so many of this family's other afternoons. The servants attend their own service, sometimes at the same church at a different hour, sometimes at a more modest church nearby, and Sunday for them brings a small but genuine easing of the week's demands, though never a complete one, because a household this size, even on the supposed day of rest, still needs fires lit and meals cooked, and a family dressed and fed, just slightly fewer of each than an ordinary weekday requires. There is something almost touching about how seriously both households take this single shared day, how much weight gets placed on it, regardless of how differently each family experiences the rest within it. It suggests, I think, something true about people generally, regardless of what century or what income they happen to have been born into, which is a deep, persistent need for at least one day that feels different from the rest, one day that asks slightly less, one day where the ordinary machinery of survival or status, whichever happens to be your particular burden, is allowed to slow down just slightly before Monday arrives and the whole structure starts turning again. I want to touch gently on one more difference between these two households before we let the evening close around them properly, and that is the question of what happens when someone in either house falls ill, because it shapes, quietly, every other decision both families make, even on days when nobody is sick at all. In the narrow terrace house, illness is genuinely frightening in a way that goes beyond the ordinary worry any parent feels watching a child run a fever. A doctor, if one is called at all, costs money the family may not have readily available, and the decision to send for one is never simple, weighed against the hope that whatever is wrong will pass on its own, the way most minor illnesses do, against the very real fear that waiting too long on something more serious could prove costly in a far worse sense than money. Medicine in this period, even the medicine wealth can buy, remains limited in ways that would surprise a modern person. Many of the treatments available more comforting than genuinely curative, and the gap between wealthy and working-class households in matters of health is less about access to dramatically better medicine, since medicine itself has real limits regardless of money in 1850, and more about access to rest, warmth, nutrition, and a doctor's attention early rather than late, all of which meaningfully shift outcomes even within medicine's broader limitations. In the grand house, a doctor can be called immediately without the same anxious calculation, and is. The family physician, often someone retained over years, knows this household, has likely attended the births of its children and the illnesses of its older members, and arrives promptly when summoned, his fee a genuine but entirely manageable cost set against the family's overall resources. A sick child in this house is nursed in a warm room by a devoted nurse and an attentive mother, fed carefully, watched closely, given whatever the period's medicine can offer without the family needing to weigh that cost against bread for the week. None of this guarantees a good outcome, because 1850 medicine genuinely cannot guarantee good outcomes in the way later centuries will eventually be able to, and grand houses bury children too, more often than any of us would like to think about for very long. But the experience of illness itself, the fear, the waiting, the quality of comfort available while waiting, differs enormously between these two homes, in ways that have very little to do with how much either family loves the person who is sick and everything to do with how much money stands behind that love when it actually needs to act. I will leave that thought there gently because it is heavy enough without dwelling on it further tonight, and because both families, in their own way, are simply doing the best any parent in any era does, which is loving their children as fully as they know how inside whatever circumstances they happen to have been given. It is past midnight now in both houses, and the night is settling into that particular deep, still quality that London nights take on once the last carriages have gone and the last candles in the front rooms have finally been snuffed. In the grand house, Sarah climbs to her own room at last, a narrow space tucked under the roof, sharing the attic floor with the cook and the other female servants, each of them in a small plain room of their own, or sometimes two to a room if the household staff is large enough to require it. The contrast between this floor and the floors below could hardly be sharper. No fire up here, none at all. The household's coal and attention both reserved for the rooms the family actually occupies. The ceiling slopes low enough that Sarah cannot stand fully upright near the walls, and the single small window set into the slope of the roof itself lets in a thin draught that the worn curtain does little to stop. Her bed is narrow, the mattress thin compared to what lies 2 floors below in the family's own rooms, the blankets adequate but not generous. She undresses quickly in the cold, says whatever brief prayer she says most nights, and is asleep, most likely within minutes, the particular deep, dreamless sleep of a body that has been working since before 5 that morning, and has perhaps 90 more minutes of rest ahead of it than the cook does, since tomorrow's fires will need lighting again at almost exactly the same early hour, regardless of how late tonight's dinner party ran. The lady and gentleman of the house, 2 floors below, occupy a bedroom considerably grander than Sarah's, with finer linens and a better mattress and the lingering warmth of a warming pan Sarah herself prepared an hour or so earlier. But the room itself, as we have already noted, holds no fire of its own tonight, and by 2 or 3 in the morning, the temperature in here will have dropped close enough to the temperature in Sarah's attic room that the actual difference in pure physical terms becomes surprisingly small. The blankets are better, the mattress is better. The cold underneath all of that is roughly the same cold, settling into the same kind of London night that does not particularly care how much money the people sleeping beneath its chill happen to have. 3 miles away in the narrow terrace house, the family has been asleep for hours already, the early bedtime that practicality demanded having delivered at least the genuine mercy of more total hours of rest than either the family or the servants in the grand house will manage tonight. The fire in their small kitchen grate has settled to a low banked glow, a careful arrangement of coal and ash that the wife built deliberately before climbing the stairs herself, designed to hold just enough heat through the night that tomorrow's fire lighting will take slightly less effort than today's did, a small mercy she has learned through years of practice to build into her own evenings whenever she has the energy left to manage it properly. Outside, between these two houses and all around them, the city itself has its own particular nighttime character, one worth lingering on for a moment, because London at this hour in 1850 is unlike any city you have ever actually walked through yourself, however many old photographs or paintings you might have seen of it. The main streets are lit, where the gas mains reach, by a row of lamps spaced at fairly regular intervals, each one a small steady glow inside its glass housing, throwing a pool of pale light onto the wet cobblestones beneath it, and leaving a stretch of genuine darkness in between, before the next lamp's light begins. A lamplighter has already made his rounds hours earlier, working his way down street after street with a long pole, lighting each lamp in turn, a job that exists only because gaslighting, still relatively new to large stretches of the city, requires this kind of manual nightly attention that later generations will eventually automate entirely out of existence. Smaller side streets, the ones where families like the Clerks actually live, often have considerably less lighting, sometimes none at all beyond whatever spills faintly from a curtained window here or there, which means walking these streets after dark requires a kind of careful, half-remembered navigation by feel and habit more than by sight. A watchman or a policeman, the newer metropolitan force having existed now for a couple of decades and gradually replacing the older, less organized watch system, walks a set route through these streets at intervals through the night, his footsteps and occasionally his voice the only human sound in an otherwise profoundly quiet stretch of city. The hour bell from a nearby church tower marks the passing of each hour, a sound that carries oddly far in the still night air, audible sometimes from several streets away. A small, steady reminder that time continues to pass even while the entire city for these few hours holds something close to its breath. And there is the smell, always the smell, because coal smoke does not simply disappear once the day's fires die down to embers. It hangs low and persistent in the cold night air, mixing with the damp that rises naturally off the Thames and off the ground itself, in a city built so close to a tidal river, producing a particular nighttime atmosphere that contemporary writers describe again and again in almost identical terms, a kind of thick, faintly acrid dampness that gets into your throat if you breathe too deeply, that settles on every surface left outdoors overnight, that will by morning have left its own thin grey film on windowsills and railings across the entire city, regardless of which neighbourhood those windowsills happen to belong to. This is the air both of our households are breathing tonight, the rich and the poor both, behind their different windows, under their different blankets, separated by 3 miles of streets that lead eventually to roughly the same cold, roughly the same coal smoke, roughly the same indifferent winter sky. I keep thinking the more time I spend with this particular city in this particular year, about fire itself, about how strange a thing it is that something so basic, so universally needed, ends up revealing so much about everything else in a society organized the way this one is. Every single person we have followed tonight, the clerk's wife with her chapped hands and her careful blacking of the grate, Sarah climbing to her cold attic room after a 16-hour day, the lady of the house drifting towards sleep in linens softer than anything the other two women will ever own. Every one of them depends completely on the same basic chemical fact that carbon burns and gives off heat, that coal dug from the ground in Wales or the north of England can be carried to London and burned in a grate and made, briefly, into warmth. Nobody in this city, however wealthy, has found a way around that basic dependency. The richest household in Mayfair and the poorest room in the worst part of the East End are both, in the end, simply burning carbon and hoping the heat lasts long enough to matter. And yet the same basic fact produces such wildly different lived experiences depending on which side of it you happen to stand. For one woman, fire is something she must create herself, with her own cracked hands every single morning, a small daily act of genuine physical labor that never stops being labor no matter how many thousands of times she repeats it. For another woman, fire is simply present, summoned invisibly by other hands, experienced only as warmth itself, the labor behind it so thoroughly hidden that she may genuinely never once in her entire life think consciously about where that warmth actually came from or what it cost someone else to produce. That gap between making warmth and simply receiving it might be as close as I can get tonight to naming the real difference between these two lives, closer even than the difference in their incomes or their houses or the number of servants standing between them and any given task. One life is organized around producing comfort through direct physical effort. The other is organized around consuming comfort that other people's physical effort has already produced. Nearly everything else we have talked about tonight, the food, the clothes, the children's educations, the entire elaborate structure of calling cards and dinner parties, sits downstream of that one basic difference, branching outward from it in 100 particular ways. I do not think this observation resolves into any simple moral lesson, and I am not going to pretend it does, because history rarely cooperates with simple lessons, however much we sometimes wish it would. The lady of the grand house is not a villain for benefiting from labor she did not perform herself. She was born into a structure that existed long before she arrived in it, and that she had realistically very little power to dismantle, even if she had fully understood it, which most people raised inside any unequal system, in any era, including our own, generally do not. The clerk's wife is not some flattened symbol of pure suffering either, because her life, hard as it genuinely was, also contained real warmth, real laughter, real moments of quiet satisfaction in a well-blacked grate, or a well-mended shirt, or a Sunday dinner that came together exactly the way she had hoped. Both lives were full, complicated, lived by real people doing their honest best inside circumstances that none of them fully chose. That is simply, I think, the truer and more useful way to hold a story like this one, rather than flattening either woman into either a victim or a villain. Let me describe the houses themselves for a moment, because we have spent so much time inside them without ever quite stepping back to look at their shape, and the shape itself tells its own quiet story. The clerk's house is one in a long, unbroken row, brick-fronted, perhaps 4 stories counting the basement, narrow enough that a person standing in the street could nearly touch both neighbouring houses by stretching their arms, though nobody would ever actually try such a thing. The basement holds the kitchen, half below street level, lit through small barred windows that let in a thin grey light during the day and almost nothing at all once evening falls, which is part of why so much of the day's work happens by firelight and candlelight regardless of the actual hour outside. A narrow staircase climbs from there to the ground floor, where the family's small parlour sits, the room used for receiving any visitors respectable enough to be received at all, kept slightly tidier and slightly colder than the kitchen most of the time, its fire lit only when company is expected or when the family can spare the extra coal for their own comfort on a particularly bitter evening. Above that, bedrooms, 2 or perhaps 3 depending on the house's exact size, sharing a single chimney stack that serves the kitchen fire below and very little else, which means these upper rooms stay close to outdoor temperature for most of the winter, regardless of how hard the household works at the fire downstairs. The grand house, by contrast, rises 5 full stories from basement to attic, its brick front dressed in pale stucco that requires its own periodic maintenance and that announces simply through its colour and its smoothness a level of investment the clerk's plain brick front never attempts. Inside, the rooms are larger, the ceilings higher, the windows taller, letting in considerably more daylight than the clerk's narrow-barred basement ever manages, though even here, daylight in a London winter remains a genuinely scarce resource, rationed by a sky that stays low and grey and smoke-streaked for weeks at a stretch. Multiple chimney stacks serve multiple fireplaces across the building's various reception rooms. The structural cost of all that brickwork and flue another quiet, invisible expense embedded permanently into the house's very construction. A cost the clerk's narrow terrace simply never had the budget to build toward in the first place. What strikes me most, looking at both houses together, is how completely their physical structure mirrors the lives lived inside them before a single person has even moved through a single room. The clerk's house is built for compactness, for shared heat, for a family living close together by simple necessity as much as by choice. The grand house is built for separation, family rooms here, servant roots there, nursery somewhere else again, an architecture that makes physical distance between different kinds of people and different kinds of labour into something as solid and permanent as the brick and stone the whole building is made from. Stay with me a moment longer because I want to pull back further still past these 2 particular houses and think about the wider year these families are living through. The one stretching out ahead of them as this particular winter night settles into its deepest, quietest hours. It is 1850. Spring will come eventually, the way it always does, even to a city that sometimes seems determined to forget what sunlight feels like by February. And waiting at the far end of that spring, scheduled now for the following May, is the great exhibition we glimpsed earlier rising in iron and glass above the bare winter trees of Hyde Park. By the time it finally opens, it will draw millions of visitors, an almost unimaginable number for the period, streaming through its enormous glass hall to look at machinery and manufactured goods and curiosities gathered from every corner of an empire that already spans a remarkable portion of the globe. The clerk's family, if they manage it at all, will likely attend on one of the cheaper admission days, saving carefully for weeks beforehand to afford the modest entrance fee and the train or omnibus fare to reach it, treating the visit as a genuine, rare, carefully planned occasion. The family in the grand house will attend whenever they please, on whichever day suits their schedule best, their tickets arranged through the same network of connections that arranges everything else in their social world. The visit itself simply one pleasant afternoon among many, rather than a singular event built up across an entire season of anticipation. Beyond that one specific event, the wider decade ahead holds changes that neither family can yet fully picture. Sitting here in the cold dark of an ordinary January night, gaslighting will keep spreading, slowly, street by street, household by household, until it reaches even neighbourhoods like the Clerk's within a couple of decades, though indoor plumbing and anything resembling a hot water tap will take considerably longer still to become an ordinary, unremarkable feature of an ordinary home rather than a luxury confined to the wealthiest households. Public health itself will undergo a genuine hard-won transformation within the coming years, as doctors and reformers gradually trace the connection between contaminated water and the cholera outbreaks that periodically tear through the city's poorer districts with terrible, indiscriminate force, a connection that will eventually reshape how this entire city manages its water and its waste, sparing countless future families a fear that hangs, even now, somewhere in the back of both these households' minds, without either of them having the language yet to fully explain what causes it. None of this is visible yet, tonight, to either woman lying in her own particular darkness. The future arrives the way it always does, one ordinary day at a time, indistinguishable in the moment from any other day, its eventual significance only becoming clear much later, to people looking back from some further point down the road these families cannot yet see. I find myself wondering, and I suspect you might too if you have been following along closely tonight, what would happen if these two women, the clerk's wife and the lady of the grand house, could somehow trade places for even a single day, could each see the other's life from the inside rather than guessing at it from the outside, the way most people in their respective positions actually did. The clerk's wife, set down suddenly inside the grand house, would likely feel at first an almost dizzying relief at the simple absence of cold, at warm water arriving without her own labour producing it, at a breakfast appearing on a table she did not have to cook herself. But I suspect that relief would curdle fairly quickly into something closer to restlessness, even boredom, an unfamiliar and faintly uncomfortable sensation for a woman whose entire life has trained her to associate worth with visible, constant, productive labour. She might find the elaborate rules of calling and visiting genuinely baffling, might struggle to understand why anyone would spend an entire afternoon on conversations so carefully calculated and so carefully limited to exactly 15 minutes apiece. She might miss, oddly, the particular satisfaction of a well-lit fire built entirely by her own hands, a satisfaction the lady of the grand house has literally never once experienced because the opportunity to feel it has never come anywhere near her. The lady of the grand house, set down in the narrow terrace house, would likely find the physical reality unbearable far faster than she expects. The cold genuinely shocking to a body that has never once had to generate its own warmth through hard labour, the work of the fire and the water and the washing overwhelming to hands that have never held a coal scuttle or a dolly stick in their entire lives. But I wonder whether she might also, somewhere underneath the shock and the discomfort, feel something unexpected too, a kind of clarity perhaps, in a life with far fewer unspoken rules to track, and far less elaborate performance required simply to be considered acceptable. The clerk's wife's relationships with her husband, her children, her neighbours, run on something closer to direct, unmediated honesty than the careful social choreography that governs nearly every interaction in the lady's own world. There might be in that something the lady of the grand house has not realized she was missing until she suddenly found herself standing in the middle of it. This is speculation, obviously a small imaginative exercise rather than anything historians can actually verify, and I want to be honest about that rather than pretending otherwise. But I think exercises like this one are useful precisely because they resist the temptation to declare one life simply better than the other, comfortable as that conclusion might feel from a safe distance of 170 years. Both women, I suspect, would discover real losses and real gains in trading places, because both lives, for all their enormous material differences, were organized around the same basic human needs: warmth, purpose, connection, a sense of doing one's life correctly according to whatever standard one had been raised to measure it against. It is nearly 3 in the morning now, the deepest, stillest hour of the night, the hour when even a city as large and as restless as London comes about as close to true silence as it ever manages. And it is happening now, in both houses, the small quiet detail I mentioned to you right at the very beginning of tonight's story. In the clerk's narrow bedroom, on the inside of the window glass, a thin film of frost has begun forming, delicate and feathered at its edges, climbing slowly across the pane the way frost always does, finding its own unhurried geometry in the cold dark. The glass is cold enough now that the small amount of moisture always present in a sleeping household's air, breath, warmth rising faintly from two sleeping bodies under thin blankets, meets that cold surface and simply gives up, turns solid, becomes this quiet white pattern that neither sleeper will notice until morning light reveals it properly. And 3 miles away, in the grand house, on a window considerably larger and considerably finer, set into a frame that cost more than the clerk earns in several months, the exact same thing is happening, the exact same physics, the exact same quiet, indifferent frost, climbing across glass that has no idea, and no reason to care, how much the house surrounding it cost to build. Ice does not check anyone's income before deciding where to form. It simply needs cold air meeting a cold enough surface, and London in January, regardless of which neighbourhood you happen to be sleeping in, provides that condition generously, democratically to every window in the entire city all at once. I keep coming back to this image, the same frost forming on two such wildly different windows at the exact same hour, because it captures something I have been trying to get at all evening without quite managing to say it directly until now. The differences between these two lives were real, were enormous, were not in any sense equal or fair by any standard we might reasonably apply to them. And yet underneath every one of those real differences sat this one small, persistent, genuinely shared experience. Two women asleep in two cold rooms on the same winter night, the same indifferent cold finding its way to both of them regardless of everything else that separated their lives so completely. Pull back further still if you can, the way you might pull back from a single page to see the whole book it belongs to. Picture the entire city at this exact hour, somewhere close to 3 in the morning. The whole of London stretched out under a low winter sky, thousands upon thousands of chimneys rising from thousands upon thousands of roofs, each one connected to a fire that some particular person, somewhere, built with their own hands at some point in the previous day, and most of them now reduced to the same quiet, banked glow our two households left behind before climbing their own particular staircases towards sleep. Somewhere in that vast spread of roofs, in the poorer eastern districts where conditions are harder than anything we have described tonight, families are sleeping in rooms colder and more crowded than the clerk's, several people sharing a single bed for warmth as much as for lack of space, the line between respectable hardship and genuine desperation thinner there than almost anywhere else in the city. Somewhere else in the newer suburbs spreading outward as the city grows, families slightly more comfortable than the clerks are managing their own versions of the same nightly rituals, their own fires, their own careful candle rationing, their own particular blend of struggle and small satisfaction. And scattered among all of this, in pockets here and there, the grand houses of Mayfair and Belgravia and the other fashionable districts hold their own particular version of comfortable cold, their own servants finally resting after their own long days, their own families sleeping under their own fine linens in their own underheated bedrooms. The whole picture, taken together, is a city of nearly 2.5 million people, the largest the world has yet produced, organized into an almost infinite gradation of comfort and hardship, every single household somewhere on that long sliding scale, and nearly every single one of them, tonight, dealing with some version of the same basic facts. Cold air, a fire that needed building, a window that will, by morning, show some trace of the night's frost. The scale of it is almost impossible to hold in your mind all at once, and I think that is, in its own way, exactly the point. History happened, and continues to happen, in exactly this kind of overwhelming multiplicity. Millions of individual nights like this one, each containing its own particular fire, its own particular cold, its own particular family doing its particular best, almost none of which gets written down or remembered by anyone beyond the people who actually lived it. Let us return one final time to the particular people we have spent this evening with, because I think they deserve a proper gentle goodbye rather than simply dissolving into the wider city we just pulled back to look at. The clerk's wife is asleep on her side, facing her husband, one arm tucked under the thin pillow, her breathing slow and even, the particular deep sleep of a body that worked hard all day and has, at least for these few hours, nothing left to ask of it. Tomorrow, before 5, she will wake to exactly this same cold, exactly this same dead fire waiting to be coaxed back into being, and she will do it again, the way she does every single day, with a competence so thoroughly practiced it no longer requires conscious thought, only the same patient hands doing the same patient work they have done 1,000 mornings before this one, and will do 1,000 mornings after it. Sarah, in her narrow attic room 3 miles away, sleeps curled more tightly against the cold than the clerk's wife does, having no second body beside her to share even a little warmth with, her own breath visible faintly in the cold attic air if anyone were awake to see it, which nobody is. She is 16 or perhaps 17, young enough that her body recovers from each day's exhaustion with a resilience that will not last forever, but that, for now, carries her through one demanding day after another without complaint, or at least without complaint that anyone above stairs would ever hear. The lady of the grand house sleeps in her own room, alone in the bed tonight, despite her husband occupying the same room. The particular Victorian arrangement of separate beds within a shared bedroom being entirely standard for a household of this class and era, her hair still loosely braided from earlier. The garnet or perhaps sapphire jewellery she wore tonight already returned to its case on the dressing table. The bronze or wine-coloured gown already hung carefully back in the wardrobe by Sarah's hands before either woman went to her own rest. She sleeps well generally despite the evening's social demands, because exhaustion of the social and performative kind, however real, tends to yield to sleep almost as readily as the physical kind. The body apparently not especially particular about which flavour of tiredness it is finally allowed to set down. And somewhere between these two households, in spirit if not in any literal geographic sense, is the girl we have not returned to in some time, the maid of all work in the smaller house with one servant, asleep on her truckle bed pulled out in the kitchen, the last of tonight's fire glowing faintly beside her, close enough that she will feel its warmth fading gradually across the night and will wake, automatically well before her mistress does, her body having learned, the way bodies learn anything repeated often enough, to track the fire's slow decline even through sleep. There is something worth saying about sleep itself here at the end of this particular night, because the way people in 1850 slept was not in certain small but genuine ways quite the same as how most of us sleep now. Some historians have suggested that in earlier centuries, before artificial light became cheap and plentiful enough to push bedtimes consistently later, many people experienced what gets called in some of the older accounts a first sleep and a second sleep, waking naturally somewhere in the middle of the night for an hour or so of quiet wakefulness, tending the fire, perhaps praying, perhaps talking quietly with a spouse, before returning to a second stretch of sleep that carried them through to morning. By 1850, with gas lighting spreading and the rhythms of urban industrial life increasingly demanding a single, continuous, clock-regulated block of nighttime rest, this older pattern was very likely already fading for many households, particularly in a city like London where work began at a fixed hour regardless of how a person's body might naturally prefer to organise its rest. But traces of it likely lingered still in quieter households, in older habits passed down without anyone quite explaining where they came from, a body waking briefly sometime past midnight, tending to the fire, and settling again, the way Sarah does almost every night, the way the maid of all work does too, their sleep shaped as much by the practical demands of fire and household as by any internal clock alone. Darkness itself, in this period, is a far more complete and total thing than most of us experience now. In a world of streetlights and screens and the constant faint glow that modern cities throw up against their own night sky, a bedroom in 1850 London, once the candle is out, is genuinely thoroughly dark. Dark enough that a person waking in the middle of the night sees essentially nothing at all until their eyes adjust to whatever faint trace of light might filter in from a banked fire or a gap in the curtains. There is something almost luxurious about that kind of darkness, from the vantage point of our own brighter, noisier, more constantly illuminated era. A depth of nighttime stillness that modern sleep, for all our comfortable mattresses and controlled temperatures, rarely manages to fully recreate. I think about that sometimes, how something we might consider a hardship, the absence of light, the absence of any easy way to banish the dark, may have also given these sleepers something genuinely valuable that grows harder and harder for us to access now. A sleep undisturbed by any glow at all, a darkness total enough that the mind eventually has very little choice but to surrender to it completely. Out on the street, the watchman completes another slow circuit of his route, his boots the only sound for several minutes at a stretch. the gas lamps holding their steady small glow against a sky that offers no real light of its own tonight, clouds thick enough to hide whatever moon or stars might otherwise be visible above the city's permanent haze of coal smoke. He has done this same walk countless times before, knows every uneven paving stone, every gap in the railings, every doorway that occasionally shelters someone with nowhere better to be on a night this cold. And he checks those doorways too, out of habit as much as duty, though tonight, at least on this particular stretch of street, he finds them empty. A cart passes. Somewhere off in the distance, the sound of its wheels and the horse's hooves carrying clearly through the still night air, the way sound travels so easily once the day's usual roar of traffic and commerce has finally quieted down to almost nothing. Perhaps it carries vegetables toward one of the great markets that will need to be stocked and ready well before dawn, the produce trade running on its own nocturnal rhythm entirely separate from the household rhythms we have spent this whole evening following, a whole different layer of London life happening in these same dark hours, equally invisible to the sleepers in both our houses, equally necessary to the city continuing to function at all. Somewhere nearer the river, the Thames itself moves on, dark and tidal and indifferent, carrying barges and the city's waste and the particular damp, faintly brackish smell that rises off any large river running through the middle of a city this size, a smell that both our households would recognize instantly, and that neither of them most likely consciously notices any more, the way you stop noticing any smell that has simply always been present in your life since before you can remember. Cats move along rooftops and through narrow passages between houses, hunting whatever a London winter night offers them to hunt, their own small nocturnal economy running parallel to the human one, equally unconcerned with which side of the wealth divide any particular alley happens to belong to. An owl, if you are very lucky and very quiet, might be heard somewhere in one of the city's larger garden squares, a sound that feels almost startling in its wildness, a small reminder that even a city as built up and as industrious as this one has not entirely banished the natural world from its margins. Not yet, not completely. In a few hours, none of this will matter anymore, because the whole cycle we watched begin this morning will simply begin again, the way it does every single day in this city, the way it has done every single day for longer than anyone currently alive can properly remember. Somewhere around 4:30 or 5, depending on her own particular household's habits and her own particular tolerance for the cold, the clerk's wife will wake, or more honestly, she will simply stop being asleep, the transition between the two states rarely feeling like a deliberate choice so much as an inevitability arriving on schedule, the way it always does. She will lie still for a moment, perhaps, gathering whatever small reserve of will it takes to leave a slightly warm bed for a thoroughly cold kitchen, and then she will do it anyway, because the fire will not light itself and the day will not wait for her reluctance to pass. At almost exactly the same hour, Sarah will wake in her own cold attic room, her body apparently incapable, even after the demands of last night's dinner party, of sleeping much past its usual early hour, years of identical mornings having trained something in her that no longer needs an actual alarm or any other external prompt. She will dress quickly in the dark, the cold motivating speed in a way that no amount of willpower alone ever quite manages to produce, and she will begin, again, the exact sequence of tasks we watched her perform yesterday morning, ash and grate and kindling, and that careful, patient breath coaxing a new flame into being. The lady of the grand house and the maid of all work's mistress will both sleep somewhat later, their mornings beginning once the actual labour of the house has already been underway for an hour or more, the fires in their respective homes already lit, or in the maid of all work's case, perhaps not quite yet, depending on how the previous night's exhaustion has settled into this particular morning's timing. And this is in the end simply what an ordinary day in 1850 London looked like, for these particular households and for hundreds of thousands of others very much like them, scattered across a city that never entirely stopped, not really even in its quietest hours, a city organised so completely around fire and labour and class that you could trace nearly every other difference between two lives back to those three simple threads if you were patient enough to follow them all the way down. There is one more subject worth lingering on before we let this particular night finish settling around both our households, and that is the question of washing, properly washing, the whole body rather than simply the hands and face that get attended to most mornings, because the answer reveals yet another quiet, persistent difference between these two lives. In the clerk's narrow house, a full bath is a genuine undertaking, not something managed daily or even, in most households of this level, weekly without real deliberate effort. There is a tin bath, kept hung on a hook somewhere out of the way when not in use, brought down and filled, gradually, with water heated in batches on the kitchen fire, the same fire that has already been asked to do so much else across the course of the day. Filling even a modest bath this way takes a considerable stretch of time and a considerable quantity of coal, both of which compete directly with everything else the household needs that fire and that fuel for. So a proper bath happens, for most families at this level, once a week at most, often on a Saturday evening in preparation for Sunday, the whole family taking turns in the same water, one after another, the eldest or the dirtiest going first while the water is cleanest and hottest, the youngest or least dirty making do with water considerably cooler and considerably less clean by the time their turn finally arrives. This was simply how a limited resource got shared fairly, or at least as fairly as a household with very little margin could manage, and nobody at this income level considered it especially strange, because everyone they knew did more or less the same thing. In the grand house, bathing is an entirely different proposition, supported by an entirely different scale of resources. The dedicated bathroom, with its proper copper tub, can be filled with hot water carried up in large jugs by housemaids whose job, among many others, includes exactly this kind of labour, performed as often as the lady of the house or any other family member requests it, which for a fastidious household might mean several times a week rather than once. The water for each person is fresh, never shared, never cooling towards someone else's turn, simply drawn and heated and carried up again as many times as the household standards and the staff's available hours allow. This is, in its own quiet way, one of the more genuinely significant material differences between these two lives, easy to overlook next to more visible markers like clothing or jewellery, but real nonetheless. A household where cleanliness is limited only by the labour available to support it, set against a household where it is limited, always, by the much harder ceiling of coal, time, and a single overworked person's finite capacity. I do not say this to suggest the clerk's family was dirty in any meaningful sense, because by the standards of their own time and their own circumstances they were not, keeping themselves and their home about as clean as their resources reasonably allowed, which is really all anyone in any era can be fairly asked to do. But the gap between what was possible for one household and what was possible for the other, even in something as basic as how often a person could be properly, fully clean, tells you something real about how completely money shapes even the most ordinary, unremarked aspects of daily bodily life. Let me give you some actual numbers here gently, because I think they help anchor everything we have described tonight in a way that pure description sometimes cannot quite manage on its own. And numbers, even spoken slowly and softly, can carry their own particular kind of weight. A clerk in a respectable London firm in 1850 might earn somewhere in the range of £80 to £120 a year, depending on his seniority and the particular firm employing him, a sum that sounds, read cold off a page, like it should provide a perfectly comfortable life, and in some narrow sense it does, placing him solidly above the truly desperate poverty found in the worst parts of the city. But against that income sits rent, perhaps £20 or £25 a year for a house like the one we have been describing, food for a family of 4 or 5 that might run to another £30 or £40 across a careful year, coal, candles, clothing, the maid of all work's modest wages if the family keeps one at all, school fees if any children attend, and the whole structure leaves remarkably little genuine slack once every necessary expense has been accounted for. A single significant illness, a single stretch of unemployment, a single unexpected expense, and a family living at exactly this level can slide, with frightening speed, from respectable struggle into something considerably more serious. A household at the level of the grand house we have spent the evening inside operates on an entirely different scale entirely. The master's income running easily into several £1,000s a year from business interests, investments, professional fees, or some combination of all three, a sum that makes the 8 or 9 servants' combined annual wages, however considerable in absolute terms, genuinely modest as a proportion of the household's total resources. The cook might earn £25 or £30 a year, more than many clerks bring home, and yet still representing, from the family's perspective, a relatively small line item against their overall budget. The housekeeper, holding more responsibility and more seniority, might earn somewhat more again, and all of these wages, substantial as they sound when compared against the clerk's own household income, still leave the people earning them living in attic rooms with no fires of their own, working 16-hour days and retiring, most of them, with very little saved against their own old age. A reminder that even quite decent wages by the standards of the period did not necessarily translate into anything resembling real long-term security for the people earning them. I find these numbers genuinely sobering every time I sit with them properly, because they make visible in cold arithmetic exactly how thin the margin was for nearly everyone below the very top of this society, and exactly how vast the gap was between that very top and almost everyone else trying to build some version of a decent, respectable life beneath it. Think for a moment about the tea both households drank today, because it carries its own quiet thread back out into a much larger world than either house could fully see from its own windows. That tea travelled an enormous distance to reach either kitchen, grown on hillsides in China, or, increasingly by this point in the century, on plantations being newly established in India under the direction of British trading interests eager to reduce their dependence on Chinese supply, carried by ship across months of ocean voyage, unloaded at London's vast docks, sold through merchants and auction houses that turned leaves grown on the far side of the world into a commodity any London household, however modest, could afford in at least some small quantity. The sugar that sweetened it, for those households that could spare sugar at all, carried its own much darker journey, grown overwhelmingly on plantations in the Caribbean that had relied until less than 2 decades earlier on enslaved labour before abolition finally ended that practice within the British Empire's own territories, though the broader global trade in sugar produced by enslaved labour elsewhere continued for some years yet, a fact that neither household sitting down to a cup of sweetened tea this evening would have necessarily thought about with any real regularity, the true cost of that sweetness having already been thoroughly separated, by the time it reached their cup, from any visible trace of where it actually came from. This is worth sitting with for a moment, gently, without turning it into something heavier than this particular evening can carry. Both households, the wealthy one and the struggling one, were connected, through something as ordinary and unremarkable as a cup of tea, to an entire global system of trade and labour and empire that neither the clerk's wife nor the lady of the grand house had much occasion to think about as they went about their respective days. The empire that built London's wealth, that filled its docks with ships and its markets with goods from every corner of the globe, touched every single household in this city in some way, however invisible that touch usually remained, woven into the smallest, most ordinary daily habits, a cup of tea, a spoonful of sugar, in ways that took the genuine human cost of producing those simple pleasures and quietly folded it out of sight long before the tea ever reached either kitchen. I mention this not to cast a shadow over either household's evening, which was in its own particular way simply an ordinary night like any other, but because I think it is honest to acknowledge how far the threads of any single ordinary day actually reach. Once you start gently pulling on them, how connected even the smallest domestic ritual turns out to be to forces and people and places well beyond the household's own 4 walls. If I had to leave you with one thread to hold on to from this entire night, out of everything we have walked through together, I think it would be this. Nearly every single thing that made either household function, that kept either family fed and warm and clothed and socially afloat, was built on women's labour of one kind or another, almost none of which the wider world of 1850 London thought to call work at all. The clerk's wife's labour was visible enough, in the sense that anyone watching her could plainly see her hands doing something at almost every hour of her waking day. And yet the period's own language refused her even this, calling what she did simply being a good wife, a proper manager of her small household, rather than labour in the same category as her husband's clerking, despite the fact that her day was, by any honest measure, considerably longer and considerably more physically demanding than his. The lady of the grand house's labour was almost entirely invisible, buried under layers of servants performing the physical tasks while she performed the social and managerial ones, and the period's language refused her too, calling what she did simply living gracefully, simply being a good hostess, simply fulfilling her natural sphere, language carefully constructed to make sure that nobody, including the women themselves most of the time, ever quite named any of it as the genuine, skilled, exhausting work that it actually was. And below both of them, Sarah and the cook and the maid of all work and the laundress and the kitchen maid and the scullery maid, an entire invisible second tier of women's labour that made everything above it possible, paid modestly, recognised barely, and almost never written into the historical record at all, except as a brief line in a household account book, a name and a wage and very little else. I do not think any of this is unique to 1850 London specifically. I think it is simply unusually visible there, in that particular moment, because the gap between the labour performed and the labour acknowledged had grown so wide, so structurally embedded into an entire city's daily life, that looking closely at almost any single ordinary day reveals it immediately, the way we have been doing tonight. The women in both these households were, each in her own way, extraordinarily capable, managing complex, demanding, unglamorous work, with a skill that any modern manager or household economist would recognize instantly as genuine expertise. None of them in their own time were ever quite permitted to call it that. Outside, somewhere beyond both households now, the very first, faintest hint of the coming dawn is still hours away, the sky over London holding on to its deep winter darkness with no real intention of loosening its grip any time soon. This is in its own way one of the small mercies of an English winter night, this long unhurried stretch of true dark that gives a city and the people sleeping inside it considerably more hours of genuine rest than a summer night ever quite manages to offer. The clerk's wife and her husband, the lady and gentleman of the grand house, Sarah in her cold attic, the maid of all work curled near her dying kitchen fire, all of them are borrowing against this same long winter darkness right now, drawing out of it whatever rest their particular circumstances allow them to take. The fire in both houses continues its slow work even while everyone sleeps, the banked coals giving off whatever heat remains in them long after the last conscious hand touched the grate, a final quiet gift from yesterday's labour to a household that will not properly appreciate it until tomorrow's effort begins building on top of what tonight's embers manage to preserve. There is something almost generous about a banked fire when you think about it properly, a small, patient, glowing promise that tomorrow will not have to start from absolutely nothing, that some fraction of today's hard-won warmth will still be there, faintly, waiting, when the next pair of cold hands comes looking for it before dawn. I think that is, in the end, a rather lovely way to think about an ordinary day in 1850 London, or really an ordinary day in any era, including the one you are living through right now as you listen to this. Each day's effort leaves something behind for the day that follows it, however small, however invisible, banked quietly in the embers for someone else, or for your own future self, to find and build on again. Let us think for just a little while longer about where these particular lives go from here, beyond this one ordinary night we have spent inside them, because I think it helps to hold a single day against the longer arc of a whole life, the way you might hold one photograph against an entire family album. The clerk's wife will likely spend the bulk of her remaining years in households very much like this one, the precise details shifting slightly as her husband's career, if it goes reasonably well, advances him a little further up the clerking ranks, perhaps eventually to a position with slightly more pay and slightly more respect attached to it, perhaps enough in time to finally afford a maid of all work of their own, shifting her own daily labour from doing every single task herself to instead supervising and assisting a single overworked young girl in much the way we described earlier tonight. Her children, if they survive childhood, which is never a certainty in this period regardless of class, though somewhat more likely for a family with her resources than for the poorest households in the city, will grow up and find their own places in a London that is changing rapidly around all of them, railways spreading, the city itself expanding outward into new suburbs, opportunities opening for at least some of the next generation that simply did not exist for their parents, Sarah if she is fortunate. And fortune in domestic service depends on a great many factors largely outside any individual servant's control. The temperament of her employers, her own health, simple chance, will continue rising slowly through the ranks of household service over the coming years, perhaps becoming a lady's maid herself eventually, a position with somewhat better pay and somewhat better standing than a general housemaid's role. Or perhaps, if she meets the right person under the right circumstances, she will leave service entirely at some point to marry, trading one demanding kind of domestic labour for another, this time on her own account rather than someone else's, in a household of her own that will look in its broad outlines considerably more like the clerk's narrow terrace house than like the grand house she currently serves. The lady of the grand house will continue her own particular trajectory, much as the earlier reflection on Constance's life suggested, her social position consolidating and maturing across the coming decade, her children eventually entering society themselves with all the careful preparation that requires, the household's standing rising or, depending on her husband's continued success, perhaps gently declining. The way fortunes in this period could shift in either direction depending on investments and business ventures that even the most careful family could not always fully control. None of these futures are fixed yet on this particular January night in 1850. They are simply the most likely paths, the ones that the patterns of this period, traced across thousands of similar lives, would lead us to expect, though any individual life, as you well know from your own, has a way of surprising even the most careful prediction sometimes, for better and occasionally for worse. There is a texture to clothing in this period that I think deserves a slow, quiet moment of its own before we let this whole evening finally settle into sleep, because what people wore against their own skin every single day was as different between these two households as nearly everything else we have described tonight. The clerk's wife dresses most days in wool and cotton, fabrics chosen as much for their durability and their ability to hold heat as for any particular fashion consideration. A dark, practical dress that will not show dirt too readily and that can be mended again and again at the elbows and the hem for years longer than its original maker probably intended. Wool against the skin has its own particular texture, slightly rough, faintly warm even before a fire gets anywhere near it. A fabric that smells faintly of lanolin and damp whenever it gets caught in London's frequent rain. A smell that becomes, over years of wear, simply the smell of being dressed at all, so familiar it stops registering as a smell in any conscious sense. Her undergarments are simple. A chemise, perhaps a single petticoat or two depending on the season and how much warmth she can afford to layer beneath her dress. None of it elaborate, all of it mended and remended until the original seams have been replaced so many times that very little of the garment's first stitching actually remains. The lady of the grand house dresses in silk, in fine wool woven considerably more finely than anything in the clerk's wife's wardrobe, in fabrics that catch light differently, that move differently, that feel, against bare skin, like an entirely different category of object, even though both women are, in the most basic sense, simply wearing cloth to cover themselves and keep warm. Her undergarments alone, the layers of camise and corset and crinoline and petticoat required to achieve the fashionable silhouette of this particular year represent more total fabric, more total labor in their construction than the clerk's wife's entire outer dress. Each layer has its own particular sound, a faint rustle of silk against silk, a slightly different texture of starched cotton against the skin beneath it, an entire sensory experience of simply getting dressed that the clerk's wife, reaching for her single practical wool dress each morning, will never once encounter in her own life. And yet, strange as this might sound, both women's clothing serves the exact same fundamental purpose, covering the body, preserving warmth, signaling through its particular cut and fabric and condition exactly where its wearer belongs in this city's elaborate social order. Clothing, in 1850 London, functions almost like a second language, legible instantly to anyone who knows how to read it, telling a passerby everything they need to know about a stranger's position in society within the first few seconds of glancing at them. The quality of the wool, the cut of the coat, the condition of the collar, the presence or absence of visible mending, all of it speaking constantly, silently, on every single street in the city. Spring will come to both these households eventually, the way it always does, even to a city that spends so much of its winter convinced otherwise. The frost on both windows will stop forming, sometime in March or April, as the air finally warms past the point where breath and cold glass can conjure that particular feathered pattern overnight. The fires will still be lit, because evenings stay cool well into late spring in this climate. But the desperate, constant dawn-to-dusk relationship with coal and kindling that has defined this entire winter will ease gradually into something more manageable. A fire built for comfort rather than for simple survival against the cold. The clerk's wife will feel that ease first in her own hands, the chapping and cracking that winter washing always brings slowly healing as the worst of the cold water work eases alongside the season itself. Sarah will feel it in the slightly later hour she can reasonably wait before lighting the first fire of the day, a small mercy that accumulates minute by minute into genuinely easier mornings as the weeks pass. The great exhibition will open eventually in May, and both these households, in their own different ways and at their own different paces, will likely make their way to Hyde Park to see it, walking or riding beneath that enormous glass roof we glimpsed rising above the bare winter trees, surrounded by exhibitors celebrating exactly the kind of industrial progress and manufactured abundance that built the very world both these households are living inside right now. However unevenly that abundance has been distributed between them, it will be, for many people who attend it, genuinely awe-inspiring, a glimpse of a future that feels for a few months that summer almost limitlessly optimistic about what human industry and ingenuity might accomplish next. But all of that is still months away on this particular January night, and neither household is thinking about spring or exhibitions or any of it right now. They are simply asleep, the way most of London is asleep at this hour, gathering whatever rest the night still has left to offer before another ordinary day, very much like this one, begins again. Before we let this particular night close completely, I want to sit for just a little longer with the simple fact of the cold itself, because it has been our quiet companion through this entire story, present in nearly every scene we visited, and I think it deserves one last unhurried moment of attention before sleep finally takes over properly. Cold, in 1850 London, was not an occasional inconvenience the way it sometimes feels in a well-heated modern home, something you notice briefly stepping outside before returning to a warm interior that erases the memory of it almost instantly. Cold was a constant background condition of life itself, for months at a stretch, something every single person in this story carried with them through nearly every hour of every winter day. Managed, mitigated, occasionally beaten back temporarily by a good fire or a warm meal, but never fully banished, not for the clerk's wife, not for Sarah, not even in any complete sense for the lady of the grand house herself. You could buy your way to less cold. Nobody in this city in this era could buy their way to none at all. There is something almost restful in sitting with that thought for a moment, strange as it might sound. The hardship was real, and I do not want to soften that or pretend otherwise. But there was also running underneath it a kind of shared condition, a common thread of simple physical experience that connected every sleeper in this city, regardless of the very real differences in everything else about their lives. The body, in the end, asks for surprisingly simple things: warmth, rest, safety enough to actually surrender to sleep rather than staying half alert against some looming threat. Every single person we met tonight got some version of those simple things, however unevenly distributed the comfort surrounding them happened to be, and every single one of them eventually, on this particular night, found their way to sleep. It makes me think oddly of how little any of us actually need, underneath all the noise and complexity we build around our lives, to finally feel that we have earned a night's rest, a fire-built well, a meal, however simple, that filled the gap it was meant to fill, a small task completed properly, even if nobody else ever notices it was done at all. The clerk's wife had this. Sarah had this. Even the lady of the grand house, for all her servants and her silk and her elaborate calendar of obligations, had this too in her own quieter way, the satisfaction of an evening managed well, a household that ran, however invisibly, exactly as it was meant to. None of them needed to be remembered by history to have lived a life that mattered, on its own terms, to the people actually inside it. I want to leave you before we close tonight with one final image, because I think it captures something true about both these lives and, honestly, about most lives, in most eras, including your own. Picture the whole city one more time, settled now into its deepest hours, 2.5 million people scattered across a landscape of brick and stone and smoke, nearly every single one of them having spent today doing some version of the same basic human work, keeping warm, feeding themselves and the people they love, managing whatever particular combination of comfort and hardship their own circumstances happened to hand them. The clerk's wife built her fire with her own cracked hands and felt, somewhere in the middle of an exhausting day, a genuine small satisfaction in a well-blacked grate and a well-mended shirt. The lady of the grand house managed her household's social standing with real skill and real intelligence, even if the period itself refused to call what she did work at all. Sarah climbed to a cold attic room after 16 hours of largely invisible labor and slept, deeply, the particular sleep of someone whose body has genuinely earned its rest. Every single person in this story did their honest best inside a structure none of them fully chose and none of them could have easily changed, and there is, I think, something quietly dignified in that, regardless of which particular position in the hierarchy any of them happen to occupy. I find myself genuinely moved by these ordinary, undramatic lives every time I spend an evening with them like this. More moved, if I am honest, than I usually am by the grander historical figures whose names actually survive in the textbooks. Nobody remembers the clerk's wife's name. Nobody remembers Sarah's either. Not really, not as an individual person rather than a category we have used tonight to stand in for thousands of young women very much like her. Even the lady of the grand house, despite her wealth and her standing, has very likely been forgotten by now too, unless some particular accident of family history or correspondence happened to preserve her name for later generations to find. And yet all three of them lived full, complicated, genuinely felt lives, every single day of which mattered enormously to the people actually living it, even if history itself never thought to write any of it down. That, I think, is worth remembering the next time you find yourself doing something small and unremarkable and entirely undramatic. Lighting a stove, mending a sleeve, managing some quiet corner of your own household that nobody else will ever fully appreciate. You are doing exactly what these women did in your own particular century, with your own particular tools, inside your own particular structure of comfort and hardship. It matters, it always mattered, even when nobody was writing it down. The fire in both these houses, the one in the narrow terrace and the one in the grand house in Mayfair, is nearly out now, just a faint steady glow beneath the ash, holding on quietly until morning. The frost on both windows has finished forming, delicate and complete, two small, identical miracles of cold and stillness, indifferent entirely to everything that separated the rooms behind them. The whole city is asleep, or close enough to it, holding its breath in that particular way only a sleeping city can, gathering itself quietly for tomorrow, when every single fire we have watched go out tonight will need, once again, patient hands and a little bit of luck to be coaxed back into being. Wherever you are tonight, whatever kind of day you have had, however warm or however cold the room around you happens to be right now, I hope you found something in this story worth carrying with you into your own rest. Let the light stay low. Let your own breathing slow, the way it always does eventually, the way it has for every tired person in every century who has ever finally allowed themselves to stop. There is nothing else you need to do right now, nothing else to manage, nothing else to mend, nothing else to light, just this quiet room and this quiet hour, and whatever rest is waiting for you, the same rest that found its way eventually to every single person we spent this evening with. Sleep well, my friend. I will see you again soon with another story, another house, another small corner of a world that has mostly been forgotten, waiting quietly for someone to come back and remember it for a little while.